Hi there. I'm glad you decided to stop scrolling and settle in with me tonight. If the day already feels far behind you, or if you're already curled up under the blankets with the lights turned down low, you're exactly where you need to be right now. Get comfortable. Because tonight we're going somewhere far older than anything you've ever laid your own eyes on. Most people assume that human evolution happened gently, quietly. Somewhere out there, spread across some wide, unremarkable stretch of land slowly over time. But that isn't what happened. The real story is stranger than that and far more violent. Somewhere around 30 million years ago, in one narrow strip of eastern Africa, the ground itself began to crack open, slowly splitting a continent in two. And that single quiet catastrophe is the actual reason you're able to stand upright, think the way you think, and exist at all tonight. Before we step into that story together, there's something small I want to ask of you. If tonight ends up meaning something to you, a like on this video helps more than you'd probably guess. And if you'd like more of these quiet nights spent wandering through the deep past together, subscribing means you'll never miss the next one. And honestly, I'd love to know something. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it exactly where you are? Somewhere else in the world, someone else is pressing play at this very same second, settling into their own version of tonight. Now, if you can dim the lights a little further, maybe let a fan hum softly somewhere in the background. Get yourself settled in, because the story we're about to walk through together begins 30 million years before the first human being ever opened their eyes. Picture Africa the way it used to be. Long before there was anyone around to picture anything at all. One single unbroken canopy of green stretching from coast to coast. Warm, humid, thick with trees, a world without valleys, without mountains, without any of the drama we now quietly associate with the word Africa. Rain fell most afternoons right on schedule. Rivers wandered wherever they pleased, unbothered by any hill standing in their way. Somewhere high up in that endless canopy, small, quick forest-dwelling apes moved from branch to branch, spending nearly all of their time without ever needing to set foot on solid ground, for more than a few careful steps at a time. Here's a mistake almost everyone makes without realizing it. When most of us picture ancient Africa, we picture the same landscape we already know today. Wide golden grassland, scattered acacia trees, one long sweeping savanna stretching toward the horizon. But that image barely existed yet. 30 million years ago, that landscape hadn't been built. It was still forming, quite literally one crack in the crust at a time. Beneath that quiet green surface, something enormous was stirring. Deep underground, a slow bloom of molten rock had begun rising beneath what is now Ethiopia, heating the crust of the earth from below, the way a flame slowly warms the bottom of a pot long before the water even starts to move. For millions of years, almost nothing seemed to happen on the surface. Then the ground began to stretch and stretch, until eventually it gave way. Geologists studying the region now believe the uplift of the Ethiopian highlands had already begun around 30 million years ago, and the deep splitting of the crust followed soon after, spreading south mile by mile, decade after decade, century after century for millions of years, all the way down through what is now Kenya and Tanzania, before finally reaching Mozambique roughly 1 million years ago. An entire continent quietly rearranging itself in slow motion in what might be the slowest, most patient home renovation project any landmass has ever attempted. So how do scientists actually know any of this tens of millions of years later, without a single written record to guide them? The answer sits buried in the rock itself. Layer after layer of ancient volcanic ash trapped between one eruption and the next, each layer dated using the slow, steady decay of a mineral inside volcanic crystals, one element quietly turning into another at a fixed, measurable rate from the moment the rock first cooled. Each layer works almost like a page in a very slow, very patient diary, telling researchers nearly exactly when each stretch of ground first formed and how fast the whole valley kept splitting further apart. The land didn't split evenly either. Along the edges of that widening crack, the ground pushed upward into new mountain ranges, some reaching nearly 2 miles into the sky. And in between those new peaks, the valley floor sank in, places dropping half a mile below where the old flat forest had once stood. Picture that for a moment. On one side, jagged new mountains reaching toward the clouds, their slopes still raw, still bare, still steaming faintly in places where fresh volcanic rock had barely finished cooling. On the other, a long deep scar running straight through the heart of the continent, half a mile down, wide enough that a person standing on one rim could no longer see clearly across to the other. And here's the detail almost nobody expects. Those new mountains did something the old flat forest never could. They blocked the moist ocean air drifting in from the Indian Sea air that used to travel freely inland, feeding that thick, humid canopy for millions of years. Once the mountains rose high enough that moisture simply stopped arriving. The valley floor below, cut off from its own rainfall, slowly began to dry out. So think about what that actually meant on the ground for whatever was surviving there. A single, uniform, humid forest spread across the whole region for millions of years was suddenly split into pieces. Cloud forest clinging to the mountain slopes, dry woodland scattered across the valley floor, open grassland pushing in at the edges. In some places, nothing left but stark, sandy scrub. All of it packed into the same narrow stretch of land, sometimes only a short walk apart from each other. You might assume that a slow, steady, unbroken forest would be the perfect setting for something new to evolve. A calm, patient world giving nature all the time it needed. Instead, it was the opposite. It was the chaos, the unpredictability. The simple fact that a creature could settle into a cloud forest and within a few generations find its whole world quietly rearranged into something completely different. That seems to be what pushed something extraordinary into motion. To understand exactly how much that mattered, it helps to look at what happened in the parts of Africa the rifting never touched. Further west, Central Africa kept most of its blanket of unbroken rainforest fully intact, the same dense, generous forest that still stands today across the Congo basin. And the apes living inside it never needed to change nearly as much. Their world simply didn't demand it. Food stayed nearby, shade stayed thick. The trees never stopped being the safest place in the world to sleep. It's one of the quiet reasons gorillas and chimpanzees, the closest living relatives we have, still spend most of their time moving through branches today, largely unchanged for millions of years. Meanwhile, a short distance to the east, an entirely different kind of pressure was building. Not because the ancestors living there were somehow braver or smarter, or built any differently to begin with, simply because the ground beneath them refused to stay the same for long enough to let anyone settle comfortably into one single way of living. What happens when a single home slowly becomes 100 different homes? What happens when the ground itself refuses to sit still for more than a few thousand years at a time? What happens when survival stops being simple and starts demanding something new? And here's something that might surprise you even more. This rift is not just an ancient story that finished tens of millions of years ago. It is still happening right now at this very moment. Fast forward for a second to a single week in September of 2005 in the Afar Desert of northern Ethiopia. A volcano named Dabahu erupted, and over about 10 days a fissure stretching 35 miles long cut straight across the desert floor, widening to 26 feet in places while the ground between sank by roughly 2 meters almost overnight. People living nearby described the earth trembling under their feet for days on end, fresh cracks spidering across the desert faster than anyone could map them, thin columns of steam and ash, rising wherever new magma pushed near the surface. Most of us imagine continental rifting as something achingly slow, something measured only in millions of years, far too gradual for any single human lifetime to notice. but here for 10 days with modern instruments recording every tremor, researchers, including geologist Cynthia Ebinger and her colleagues, watch something remarkable unfold. The same forces that spent 30 million years slowly building the entire valley had in this one small stretch of desert compressed themselves into 10 days right in front of living witnesses. Their conclusion was even stranger than the crack itself. The processes at work underneath that desert floor turned out to be nearly identical to the ones shaping the bottom of the world's oceans, which means that narrow strip of cracked earth and the neighbouring waters of the Red Sea beside it may quite literally be the opening stage of a brand new ocean, one that scientists now expect will fully separate the Horn of Africa from the rest of the continent within a few million years, as seawater slowly floods in to fill the widening gap. So the very ground that first pulled itself apart to build the human story never actually stopped moving. It is still pulling apart tonight by roughly the width of a fingernail every year. Patient, almost invisible, utterly unstoppable. Long after every person listening to this story is gone, that same slow gap will keep widening quietly without anyone left to notice. Scientists still argue even now about exactly what all that ancient cracking, drying and rearranging actually did to the creatures living through it. Some researchers point to the open grassland itself, the wide savanna spreading out across the valley floor, and argue that standing upright gave early ancestors a way to see further over the tall grass, to spot danger or food from a distance. Others look more closely at the actual shape of the broken land, the rough, uneven, hilly terrain left behind by all that cracking and shifting, and argue that survival depended less on open, exposed plains and more on navigating difficult, fractured ground, uphill and downhill day after day, hiding as much as walking. Maybe it really was the grass. Maybe it was the broken hills and the narrow valleys and the mountains blocking the rain. Or maybe, and this might be the quietest possibility of all, it wasn't any single feature of that landscape at all. Maybe it was simply the unbearable unpredictability of everything happening at once, a world that refused to hold still. A world no ancestor could ever fully adjust to and then finally relax. There's another reason this cracked, restless region matters so much, and it has almost nothing to do with evolution itself. It has to do with memory. In a stable, unbroken rainforest like the one still standing today across the Congo Basin, almost nothing gets preserved. Fallen bones rot away within a few short years, swallowed by damp soil, thick roots, and constant decay. But inside an active rift valley, the very same eruptions that kept reshaping the landscape also kept quietly burying it layer after layer of fine volcanic ash, settling gently over rivers, lake shores, and anything unlucky enough to die nearby. Those layers hardened into rock-sealing bones inside them like pages pressed shut in a book nobody would open again for millions of years. Later, as that same restless ground kept shifting and eroding air and water, slowly carved straight back down through those buried layers, exposing tidy, dateable slices of deep time, laid open right on the surface for anyone patient enough to go looking. Without that constant cycle of burial and erosion, most of what we now know about the earliest ancestors of every single person alive today would very likely have simply rotted away unnoticed and unrecorded somewhere else entirely. The very violence that built this valley is the same violence that millions of years later would hand paleontologists an extraordinary gift. An open readable archive of human origins written directly into the rock, waiting quietly underground the whole time. Whatever the true answer turns out to be, one thing is no longer in question. This same region, this same trembling, cracked, restless stretch of Eastern Africa, is where nearly every major turning point in the early human story would eventually take place. The rift that split a continent in two didn't just rearrange rock and soil. It created dozens of separate, isolated pockets of habitat, each one changing on its own private timeline, each one quietly running its own experiment in survival. And somewhere inside that shifting patchwork of forest, grassland and stone, an answer to an ancient question slowly, stubbornly began to take shape. It's worth sitting with that for a moment tonight of all nights. The ground beneath you right now, wherever you happen to be listening from, carries a distant echo of that same restlessness. Not the same danger, of course, not the same uncertainty, but the same underlying pattern. Change quietly, forcing something new into being. Almost every fault line on this planet seems to carry the same quiet lesson that the places which feel the most unstable, the least comfortable to settle into, are very often the exact places where something new eventually has no choice but to grow. And that pattern first, written into the cracking earth of Eastern Africa, millions of years before anything human existed, is still folded somewhere inside you tonight, whether you've ever thought about it or not. It's a strange thing to sit with, right before sleep, somewhere underneath everything calm and familiar about your own life. There's a piece of you that was quietly shaped by ground that once refused to hold still. But an answer forming in the land is one thing. Standing up and actually walking across it is something else entirely. Because long before any brain grew larger, and long before any tool was ever shaped by a careful hand, something else had to happen first. Something that would quietly decide once and for all why our earliest ancestors ever bothered lifting themselves up onto two legs in the first place. That question turns out to have a stranger answer than most people expect, and it does not begin in the same cracked, trembling valley we just walked through together. It begins somewhere else entirely. Somewhere most textbooks for a very long time refused to even consider. For decades, almost every scientist studying human origins assumed the answer had to be sitting somewhere inside the rift, in that narrow band of Eastern Africa where the ground kept splitting and drying and rearranging itself. It made sense. It was tidy. It fit the story neatly. Then, in the year 2001, a small team of French and Chadian researchers, working far to the west in the middle of the Sahara, pulled something out of the sand that quietly broke that tidy story apart. The site was called Toros Manala, deep inside the Jurab Desert in the country of Chad, thousands of miles from any rift valley at all. The scientist leading the project, a French paleontologist named Michel Brunet, had spent nearly 3 decades searching that same stretch of desert before his team finally found what they were looking for. A skull. Ancient, crushed, almost flat by millions of years of pressure but largely intact. Local workers on the excavation gave it a name in the Dazaga language of the region, Tumai. It means roughly hope of life. Here's the number that stunned everyone who heard it. Tumai turned out to be somewhere between 6.8 and 7.2 million years old, making it by a wide margin one of the oldest possible ancestors of the human line ever discovered. Its brain was tiny, barely larger than a modern chimpanzee's, but something about the base of that skull refused to sit quietly. The opening where the spinal cord connects to the brain, a small hole scientists call the foramen magnum, was positioned unusually far forward, tilted underneath the skull, the way it sits in a creature that holds its head upright on top of a body, walking on 2 legs, rather than out behind it, the way it sits in an animal that walks on all 4s, which raised an uncomfortable question for the neat riff-based version of the story. If something out in the Sahara, thousands of miles from any rift valley, might already have been standing upright 7 million years ago, then whatever pushed our ancestors onto 2 legs could not have been some single tidy event, confined to one dramatic crack in the crust. Something bigger and messier and spread across a much wider stretch of the continent appears to have been happening all at once. There's a detail about this discovery that almost never makes it into the documentaries, and honestly it might be my favourite part of the whole story. Alongside that skull, the same excavation also turned up a thigh bone, a femur, but at the time in 2001 nobody realised what they were holding. It got boxed up, mislabelled among a pile of ordinary animal bones, and shipped off to a laboratory in France. It sat there quietly for nearly 2 years until a graduate student happened to notice it didn't look like it belonged with the rest of the collection at all. Can you imagine that moment, sorting through crate after crate of unremarkable fossil fragments and then picking one up that suddenly feels different in your hand? For years afterward, that single femur became the centre of a quiet, uncomfortable disagreement inside the research community, the kind of disagreement that rarely gets mentioned when a discovery gets turned into a headline. It would take specialists more than a decade and eventually a fresh, careful analysis, published only a few years ago, to conclude that the bone really does look consistent with walking upright, alongside plenty of evidence that this same creature still spent real time moving through trees. Not a clean, simple answer. A blurry, complicated one sitting somewhere between two worlds on the ground and in the branches at once. A little less than 1 million years later and more than 1,000 miles to the east back inside the familiar territory of the rift itself, another set of bones turned up that only deepened the puzzle. In the year 2000, in the Tugan Hills of Kenya, a team led by 2 French researchers, Brigitte Senut and Martin Pickford, uncovered fragments belonging to a creature nicknamed rather cheerfully the Millennium Man, simply because of the year it happened to surface. This one dated to somewhere around 6 million years old, left behind a thigh bone with a particular thickness and internal structure that closely matched what you would expect from a creature bearing weight on 2 legs day after day. And yet at the very same time, its curved, elongated finger bones told a second, quieter story. Fingers built for gripping branches, for climbing, for not fully letting go of the trees just yet. Put these 2 creatures side by side for a moment, one from the deserts of Chad, one from the highlands of Kenya, separated by 1,000 miles and roughly 1 million years, and a pattern starts to emerge that nobody expected going in. Walking upright, it seems, did not arrive as one single dramatic breakthrough discovered once, and then simply inherited by everyone who came after. It looks instead like something several different lineages may have been quietly experimenting with independently in several different corners of the continent, long before any of them fully committed to leaving the trees behind for good. If Tumai and the Millennium Man suggested that walking upright might have started earlier, and in more places than anyone expected, another discovery further south inside Ethiopia would end up complicating the story even further in a completely different way. Her name was Ardi. A team led by an American paleoanthropologist named Tim White began finding pieces of her skeleton in the early 1990s scattered across a dusty stretch of the Middle Awash region. It took them nearly 2 decades of careful, painstaking work before they were ready to say anything publicly at all. The bones were unbelievably fragile, crushed almost to powder, in places some of them so soft that a single careless touch could turn ancient anatomy into dust. They had to be excavated in solid blocks of surrounding sediment, wrapped and hardened for transport, then digitally pieced back together fragment by fragment on a computer screen, almost like restoring a shattered piece of pottery, without ever being allowed to touch the pieces directly with bare hands. When the full picture of Ardi finally reached the public in 2009, it landed as one of the biggest scientific stories of that entire year. She stood barely 4 feet tall. Her brain was smaller than a quarter of the size of yours sitting inside your skull right now as you listen to this. And she spent her days, according to White's team, somewhere around 4.4 million years ago, moving through a landscape thick with trees, not open sweeping grassland at all. That last detail mattered enormously because it went straight against a long-held theory some of you might already have guessed. The idea that grasslands spreading wide and dry across the continent forced our ancestors down out of the trees and up onto 2 legs simply to survive. If Ardi really was moving through wooded, shaded terrain, then walking upright did not begin as some desperate response to open, exposed grass at all. It may have started somewhere gentler, somewhere greener, except, and this is where the story gets wonderfully messy, not everyone agreed, A separate team of geologists examining the exact same soil, the exact same fossilized plants and pollen from that same patch of ancient ground, argued the opposite conclusion entirely. Their data, they said, pointed toward a landscape made up of nearly half grassland mixed unevenly with trees. Not a forest at all in their interpretation. Something closer to open savanna with patches of shade scattered through it. So which version is true, even now? Honestly, nobody can tell you with complete certainty. And there's something oddly comforting about that if you think about it for a moment. Two respected teams of scientists looking at the very same handful of ancient soil reaching two different conclusions. It's a quiet reminder that even the most confident-sounding scientific claim is often still a story in progress waiting patiently for the next person willing to dig a little deeper. What we do know with a bit more confidence is a much stranger detail buried inside Ardi's jaw. Her canine teeth, the sharp, dagger-like teeth most male apes use to threaten and intimidate rivals, were small. Noticeably smaller than you would expect in a typical wild ape. One researcher and anthropologist named Owen Lovejoy has spent years arguing that this single detail might hint at something remarkable about how these early ancestors were living. Less violent competition between males, possibly even something resembling long-term partnerships, where a male might have carried food back to a single female and her offspring, freeing both of them from constantly needing to forage and defend territory at the same time. If that idea holds up, it suggests walking upright may not have started purely as a matter of survival at all. It might have started, at least in part, as a matter of relationships. Hands freed up not to fight but to carry. Of course, that is only one explanation among several, and scientists studying this question love nothing more than disagreeing with each other respectfully for decades at a time. A different research group approached the same mystery from an entirely different angle. Instead of digging through fossils, they strapped oxygen masks onto chimpanzees and onto a small group of human volunteers and had all of them walk on treadmills side by side. The chimpanzees were not thrilled about the experiment, to put it gently. Researchers had to coax them along with juice boxes, and more than once a chimpanzee simply reached out, hit the emergency stop button with one hand, and refused to continue. But the numbers that came out of that slightly chaotic experiment were remarkable. On average, walking upright on two legs cost the human volunteers roughly 1/4 of the energy that knuckle walking on all fours cost the chimpanzees, covering the exact same distance, which suggests a wonderfully unglamorous possibility. Maybe our ancestors never stood up out of dramatic necessity or clever social planning at all. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe walking upright was quite literally the cheaper option, and cheaper options tend to win out quietly generation after generation, whether anyone intended it or not. Still others point towards something even more basic: body heat. A researcher named Peter Wheeler spent years calculating exactly how much direct sunlight strikes a creature, walking upright compared to one moving around on all fours, low to the ground during the hottest hours of the day. His numbers showed that standing tall with less of your body directly facing the overhead sun and slightly more of you catching whatever breeze exists higher off the ground could meaningfully reduce the risk of overheating in a hot exposed landscape. A small advantage maybe, but small advantages repeated across thousands of generations have a way of quietly reshaping an entire species. So which explanation actually wins, the forest theory or the grassland theory? The energy argument or the body heat argument? The idea of hands freed for carrying food to a partner, or something even simpler, still waiting to be discovered. Maybe it really was about saving energy, one small metabolic advantage compounding invisibly across an almost unimaginable stretch of time. Maybe it really was about staying cool enough to survive the hottest hours beneath an unforgiving sun. Or maybe, and this might be the quietest and most honest possibility of all, it was never just one single reason at all. Maybe walking upright was simply useful in a dozen small overlapping ways, in a dozen slightly different corners of an unpredictable continent and evolution patient, and indifferent as always kept whatever worked. And whatever the true reason turns out to be, walking upright was never some free upgrade handed down without any cost attached. It came with a price tag that every single one of us still quietly pays even tonight. Standing on 2 legs instead of 4 rearranged the entire structure of the hip, the spine, and the birth canal in ways that made childbirth measurably more difficult and more dangerous for our species than it tends to be for almost any other primate on the planet. Researchers sometimes call it the obstetrical dilemma, this strange evolutionary trade, wider hips for easier birth, balanced awkwardly against narrower hips built for efficient walking. It's also very likely part of the quiet reason so many of us end up lying awake some nights with a dull ache somewhere along the lower back. A small, everyday reminder of a design that was never quite finished, just good enough eventually to work. Whatever the true answer turns out to be, something remarkable happened somewhere between 7 million years ago and 4 million years ago. A handful of creatures scattered from the deserts of Chad to the woodlands of Ethiopia began quietly rearranging the basic architecture of their own bodies. Long before anyone could speak a single word, long before anyone could sharpen a stone into a useful edge, long before any brain had grown large enough to plan or wonder or dream, they simply stood up, awkwardly at first, unevenly probably with plenty of stumbling nobody was ever around to record, and that quiet, imperfect decision repeated by countless anonymous ancestors across an enormous stretch of shifting African landscape ended up mattering more than almost anything else that happened next. Because once those hands were finally free, no longer needed for walking, no longer pressed against the ground with every single step, something else became possible for the very first time. Not thinking exactly, not yet, but reaching, carrying, shaping. A pair of open hands dangling loosely at the sides of a body that had just quietly rearranged its entire relationship with the ground beneath it. If you've ever wondered why a task as simple as carrying a cup of tea to bed tonight barely requires a second thought, this is where that quiet, invisible convenience actually began. Not with a plan, not with any single flash of insight, just with a slow, stubborn willingness repeated across an almost unimaginable stretch of time to keep standing back up. And somewhere in the deep, patient stretch of time that followed that simple freedom in a pair of open hands would quietly set the stage for the very next chapter of this story. One written by a small, remarkable woman whose bones would eventually surface from the dust of northern Ethiopia and change absolutely everything scientists thought they understood about how this whole journey began. Her story almost never got told at all. On a quiet morning in November of 1974, in a dry, sunburned stretch of northern Ethiopia, called Hadar, a paleoanthropologist named Donald Johansen had every reason to skip his usual survey that day. He was behind on paperwork, the kind that never seems to shrink no matter how many hours you throw at it. The heat was already climbing the sky, doing that pale, bleached-out thing it does over open desert by mid-morning. His graduate student, a young man named Tom Gray, was the one who eventually talked him into a short detour just to map one more gully before heading back to camp. Almost as an afterthought, the two of them wandered down a slope neither had planned on checking that day at all. That single change of plans is the entire reason we know her name today. Johansen noticed a fragment of arm bone catching the late morning light, then a piece of skull, then a thigh bone, ribs, part of a jaw or pelvis. Piece after piece scattered across the slope like someone had simply set her down there and walked away 3.5 million years ago. By the time the excavation finished, Johansen's team had recovered around 40% of an entire skeleton, an almost unthinkable amount for a fossil that old. Most ancient hominins survive as a single tooth, a broken jaw fragment if researchers are lucky. This was something else entirely, later using the same kind of layered volcanic ash dating that helps researchers date so much of this region's deep past. Scientists pinned Lucy's age down to somewhere near 3.2 million years, a strikingly precise number for a skeleton. this old made possible by a hardened ash layer sitting just above the spot where she'd been quietly resting the entire time. That night back at camp, someone kept playing a cassette tape of a Beatles song on repeat. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Somewhere between the music and the excitement, one of the team members suggested it half joking. Why not call her Lucy? The name stuck even though the local Ethiopian researchers on the team had already given her something quieter and honestly more beautiful. Dinkinesh in the Amharic language, which translates roughly to "you are marvellous." Both names get used to this day depending on who's telling the story. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second before we go any further. What do you think made this particular skeleton so important? It wasn't simply that Lucy was old, or even that so much of her survived. It's what her bones did when scientists laid them out side by side and studied them properly. Her skull was small, barely larger than a chimpanzee's, with a brain roughly the size of a grapefruit. Nothing about her head suggested anything resembling human intelligence. And yet her pelvis, her knee joint, the angle where her thigh bone met her hip told an entirely different story. That part of her body was unmistakably built for walking upright, fully confidently on two legs, the exact same basic mechanics your own hips are using right now if you happen to be sitting up in bed. A small ape-brained creature walking like us 3.5 million years before anyone alive today was born. There's another detail about her skeleton that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story, and it's worth pausing on for a moment. Lucy's arms were long, proportionally longer than yours or mine, curling down nearly to her knees, and her fingers carried a slight distinct curve. The same sort of curve you still see today in animals that spend real time gripping branches overhead. Her rib cage, once reconstructed, flared outward into a shape closer to a chimpanzee's than a modern human's cone-shaped rather than barrel-shaped. None of that erases what her hips and knee were telling researchers. It simply means Lucy hadn't finished completely with the trees. She belonged to a strange in-between chapter of the story, an ancestor with the legs of a committed groundwalker and the arms of someone who still now and then needed somewhere safe to climb once the sun went down. For a long time, plenty of scientists had quietly assumed the opposite order of events. Bigger brains first, and then eventually walking upright as some clever downstream benefit of all that new intelligence. Lucy turned that assumption completely on its head. Whatever pushed our ancestors up onto two legs, and we spent some time last chapter picking apart a few competing theories about exactly what that pressure might have been, it clearly had nothing to do with cleverness. The legs changed first. The mind, whatever was coming next, would have to wait. A year after Lucy's discovery, Johansson's team found something even stranger scattered across a nearby stretch of the same valley. Not one skeleton this time, but fragments belonging to at least 13 individuals, adults and children mixed together, all from the same species, all seemingly buried or perhaps swept together at roughly the same moment in time. Newspapers back home nicknamed the discovery the First Family, and while nobody can say for certain exactly what happened to that group on whatever day they died, the sheer number of individuals found together offered something Lucy alone never could. Proof that walking upright wasn't some rare isolated trick performed by one unusually gifted individual. It was already by then simply how her entire community moved through the world. It's worth clearing up something people get wrong about Lucy fairly often while we're here. She isn't literally the first human being who ever existed. And she isn't some single solitary ancestor standing alone at the root of our entire family tree, the way she sometimes gets described in casual conversation. She's simply the best preserved, most famous known member of a species that, thanks to the First Family site and dozens of related discoveries since we now know, was a whole thriving population spread across this stretch of Ethiopia for hundreds of thousands of years. Lucy didn't start this story by herself. She's just the version of it we happen to find in the best possible condition. Now here's where the story takes a turn I truly love telling, because it involves a completely different kind of evidence, not bones at all. 4 years after Lucy surfaced from that Ethiopian slope, A separate team working roughly 1,000 miles south in Tanzania stumbled onto something almost unbearably intimate. This team was led by Mary Leakey, part of a family whose name by that point had already become nearly synonymous with the entire search for human origins. Her crew was combing a site called Litoli, mostly hunting for animal bones preserved in ancient volcanic ash, when someone noticed a trail of strange, oddly familiar indentations pressed into the hardened ground. Footprints. Roughly 3.6 million years ago, a nearby volcano called Sadiman had dusted the landscape with a fine layer of wet ash. Picture the scene for a moment if you can, letting your eyes drift shut. Grey ash drifting down slowly across an open plain, almost like a strange silent snowfall settling over grazing animals, guinea fowl, ancient elephants, a few skittish antelope, every one of them leaving their own scattered tracks across that same soft surface. Then not long after, a brief spell of rain, just enough to dampen the ash into something closer to wet plaster than dry powder. For a short window, that ash behaved almost exactly like wet cement, soft enough to hold a shape, and then thanks to a light rain, shortly afterward it hardened just enough to preserve whatever pressed into it, before the next layer of ash sealed everything underneath undisturbed for millions of years. Something walked across that wet surface. Not one creature, at least two moving side by side, their strides falling into an unmistakably human rhythm, heels striking first weight, rolling forward through an arched foot, big toe pushed off in line with the rest of the foot, instead of splayed out to the side the way it sits on a chimpanzee or gorilla. And tucked in among those two trails, researchers eventually notice something that quietly stops people in their tracks even now, nearly 50 years later. A third, smaller set of footprints stepping directly inside the larger prints ahead of it, as if someone smaller had been following closely, matching stride for stride, careful not to fall behind, or perhaps simply choosing the easier, already flattened ground instead of breaking a fresh path of their own. Nobody will ever know exactly who those three individuals were to each other. Family, companions, strangers who simply happened to cross the same stretch of damp ash within moments of one another. Would it change how this whole story feels to you if it turned out they were a family, rather than three strangers who never even knew each other existed? Whoever they were, they left behind something bones alone can never fully capture. Not just proof that walking upright existed, proof of an actual walk, a specific unrepeatable afternoon frozen mid-step longer ago than most of us can meaningfully picture, and somehow still recognizable instantly as something a person might do on an ordinary evening walk tonight. It's worth pausing on that thought for a moment honestly. The next time you get up out of bed for a glass of water or pad quietly down a hallway so you don't wake anyone else in the house, you'll be repeating almost exactly a motion first pressed into wet volcanic ash 3.6 million years ago by someone whose name, language, and entire world have vanished completely, leaving behind nothing except the shape their feet made in the ground. Here's a detail rarely mentioned outside academic papers, and it might be my favourite thread in this whole story. Mary Leakey and Donald Johansen. The two researchers responsible for these two discoveries, Lucy and the footprints, spent years afterward locked in a surprisingly sharp disagreement over what they had actually found. Leakey suspected the Litoli footprints belonged to something more advanced than Lucy's species, possibly an early member of our own genus Homo walking further and more efficiently than a creature with Lucy's small brain should have been capable of. She even described the gait preserved in those tracks as somewhat rolling, almost swaying at the hip with each step different enough from a fully modern stride that she wondered whether a more advanced walker had left them behind. Johansen argued the opposite, insisting Lucy's species Australopithecus afarensis was perfectly capable of producing exactly that kind of confident upright trail all on its own, swaying hips and all. It became by most accounts a notably heated professional rivalry. Two brilliant, strong-willed scientists, each convinced the other had misread the evidence sitting right in front of them, and neither one particularly interested in backing down in front of the cameras and journals watching closely, which theory eventually won out. Most researchers today lean toward Johansson's interpretation, treating the footprints as further confirmation that Lucy's own species really was walking this way. But even now, a handful of specialists still argue the case isn't fully settled, and newer footprint discoveries at Laetoli in recent years have only added more texture to the debate, hinting that more than one type of upright walker might have been sharing that same ancient landscape at roughly the same time. Maybe those three walkers really did belong to Lucy's own species, moving in exactly the confident, familiar stride her skeleton already suggested. Maybe they belong to something slightly different, a cousin species science hasn't fully sorted out yet. Or maybe, and this feels like the gentlest way to leave it before we move on, tonight it barely matters which name gets attached to those footprints at all. What matters is that someone 3.5 million years ago walked upright across open ground with the same unhurried confidence you might use crossing your own living room right now, half asleep, barely thinking about the motion at all because your body already knows exactly how. It's hard to overstate how much that single small skeleton rearranged an entire field of science almost overnight. Before Lucy, the leading assumption in most textbooks leaned heavily toward a story sometimes nicknamed the brain-first idea, the notion that intelligence, tool-making, and cleverness must have arrived early, driving everything else, including upright walking as a kind of downstream reward. Lucy quietly, without saying a single word, forced an entire generation of researchers to rewrite that assumption from the ground up. Whatever made us human, clearly it did not begin inside the skull. Between a single remarkable skeleton pulled from an Ethiopian hillside and a set of footprints pressed into ancient ash, 1,000 miles away, one thing had become impossible to argue with any longer. Walking upright wasn't a fluke or a rare experiment tried out by one isolated group and then abandoned. It was already, by 3.5 million years ago, simply what this entire lineage did everywhere. It went long before a single tool had ever been shaped, and long before anyone would have recognized a flicker of anything resembling deliberate thought behind those small, quiet, ape-sized skulls. There's something quietly humbling about sitting with both of these discoveries at once tonight of all nights. A skeleton and a set of footprints, a body and a motion. Lucy tells you what an ancestor looked like frozen, and still the shape of a life you'll never fully know the details of. The footprints tell you something almost more intimate. What that same kind of ancestor actually did on one particular afternoon when nobody watching could have possibly guessed that 150,000 generations later, someone lying in bed on the far side of the planet would still be thinking about their walk. Which raises a question worth carrying with you into whatever comes next in this story. If the legs were already finished, patient-capable, fully formed 3.5 million years before anything we would recognize as human intelligence appeared, what on earth were those free upright hands actually doing with all that time in between? As it turns out, the answer would end up buried in a dry riverbed even further west, waiting quietly for someone with a sharp enough eye to notice that a handful of ordinary-looking stones were never really ordinary at all, that someone turned out to be a woman named Sonia Harmond, and the sharp eye she needed for this discovery almost never got the chance to prove itself at all. It's funny, honestly, how many of the biggest turning points in this whole story seem to hinge on something as small as a single afternoon going slightly differently than planned. In July of 2011, Harmond and a research partner, Jason Lewis, were leading a team through the dusty, sun-bleached terrain of West Turkana, in northern Kenya, part of a long-running excavation effort called the West Turkana Archaeological Project 1 that had already spent nearly 2 decades quietly combing that same stretch of desert, season after season, long before anyone involved had any reason to expect a headline-making find. The plan that particular morning was straightforward enough. Drive to a specific previously identified site and continue the survey work already underway there. Except somewhere along the way the team took a wrong turn. Isn't it strange? How often the biggest discoveries seem to happen because someone got a little lost first. Wandering slightly off course, the team stumbled onto an entirely different stretch of ground nobody had planned to examine that day, a place that would later be named Lomekwi 3. The sun sat high and unforgiving over pale cracked earth, the kind of heat that makes even seasoned researchers move a little slower, watch their footing a little more carefully. And scattered across the surface, half buried in loose sediment, sat a collection of stones that to an untrained eye would look like nothing more than ordinary rubble, the sort of thing you'd step right over without a second glance. Harmon's eye, trained across decades studying exactly this kind of material, immediately recognized something else: sharp edges, distinct fracture patterns radiating out from clear, deliberate points of impact. The unmistakable signature of one stone being struck against another again and again by something with hands and intention, rather than by simple weather and time slowly wearing rock down at random. It would take Harmon's team 4 more years of careful excavation testing and analysis before they felt confident enough to publish what they had found. When the results finally appeared in the journal Nature in 2015, the number attached to those stones sent a quiet shockwave through the entire field of human origins research. 3.3 million years old. Sit with that figure for just a second, because here's why it matters so much. The previous record holder for oldest known stone tools, a collection called the Oldowan Industry, found decades earlier at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, sat at roughly 2.6 million years old. Lomekwi pushed that timeline back by around 700,000 years. And here's the detail that turned the whole story upside down. For as long as anyone had been seriously studying human origins, the working assumption had always been simple, almost comfortable in its simplicity. Toolmaking belonged to us, to the genus Homo. It was one of the defining traits separating our clever, resourceful branch of the family tree from every other creature that had ever walked across this same African landscape. Except the earliest confirmed fossils belonging to the genus Homo only go back around 2.3 million years, which leaves an uncomfortable gap of exactly 1 million years stretching out in front of these stone tools, with absolutely nobody from our own genus around yet to have made them. So who did? That question still doesn't have a clean settled answer, and honestly it might not for a long while yet. 2 candidates keep coming up in the scientific conversation, and both of them happen to be wandering around roughly that same corner of Kenya at roughly that same moment in deep time. One is a species called Kenyanthropus plateops, a strange flat-faced hominin known from a single controversial skull pulled from the ground not far from Lomekwi itself back in 1999 by a team led by yet another member of that same remarkable Leakey family. We met earlier in this story, this time a researcher named Meave Leakey. The skull was badly distorted by millions of years of pressure, crushed and cracked, in ways that made its true shape remarkably difficult to pin down, which is exactly why some researchers argue it deserves its own separate branch on the family tree, while others suspect it might simply be a warped, oddly preserved example of something far more familiar, wearing an unfamiliar face only because the rock did such a thorough job of squeezing it out of shape. The other candidate is a face you already know from earlier in this story, Lucy's own species, Australopithecus afarensis. Small-brained, fully upright, already confirmed as capable walkers, and as it turns out quite possibly capable of a great deal more than anyone previously gave that species credit for. Harmon's team eventually gave this newly discovered toolmaking style its own name, calling it the Lomekwian, after the site where it first surfaced, marking it as something distinct from the Oldowan tradition that would follow it hundreds of thousands of years later. It's a small act giving something a name, but it matters. It's science quietly admitting that this wasn't simply an early, clumsy attempt at Oldowan technology. It was its own separate chapter entirely, with its own separate rules, invented by someone whose identity we still can't fully confirm. Here's a small human detail about the Lomekwi tools worth pausing on because it tells you something about the mind behind them. These stones are noticeably larger, heavier and cruder than the later Oldowan tools that would follow them by hundreds of thousands of years. Researchers studying the fracture patterns concluded that whoever made them likely needed both hands, just to hold and strike the stone, sometimes resting one rock against a flat surface, like a makeshift anvil, and hammering down on it from above rather than the more refined one-handed striking technique later toolmakers would eventually master. If that technique sounds oddly familiar, there's a reason. It closely resembles the way modern chimpanzees crack open hard-shelled nuts today, wedging one stone in place and pounding another down onto it again and again until the shell finally gives way, which raises a wonderfully strange possibility. Maybe stone tool use didn't begin as some sudden flash of human-style cleverness at all. Maybe it started as something far more familiar, an old inherited habit, already sitting somewhere in the shared ancestry connecting us to chimpanzees, one that simply got sharpened quite literally over the following few million years into something new. There's something worth sitting with in that idea if you let it settle for a moment. We tend to imagine intelligence arriving suddenly like a switch being flipped somewhere deep inside an ancient skull. The truth, at least according to stones like these, looks far more patient than that. Less a lightning strike, more a slow, stubborn habit practiced quietly for millions of years by creatures nobody would have called clever at the time, until one day, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened, that habit had turned into something the rest of the animal kingdom simply couldn't match. Now here's where the story takes an even stranger turn, because Lomekwi, remarkable as it is, might not even be the earliest sign of this behaviour. A different research team, led by an archaeologist named Shannon McFerran, and working alongside the paleoanthropologist Zerasane Alemseged, was digging roughly 1,000 miles northeast in a spot called Dakika in Ethiopia, near enough to Hadar that Lucy's own discovery site sits practically within walking distance. In January of 2009, buried in sediment, their team's geologist would later date to roughly 3.4 million years old, slightly older even than the Lomekwi stones themselves. Researchers uncovered two ordinary-looking animal bones, a rib from something roughly cow-sized and a thigh bone from something closer to the size of a goat. Both bones carried faint, unmistakable scratches and dents pressed into their surface, the kind of marks that don't simply appear from nothing. The team argue those marks could only have come from one source: sharp-edged stone dragged deliberately across flesh and bone in the unmistakable pattern of butchery, someone stripping meat and marrow off a carcass, using whatever tool happened to be within reach. Naturally, not everyone agreed. A separate group of researchers, including an archaeologist named Manuel Dominguez Rodrigo, pushed back hard, arguing that the marks looked less like careful butchery and more like ordinary trampling, the kind of scratches you'd expect if a herd of animals had simply walked back and forth across those bones for a few thousand years, grinding them against loose sediment and grit. McFerran and Alemseged in turn stood firmly behind their original interpretation of the evidence, insisting the marks fell well outside the range of anything trampling alone could plausibly produce. For a while, the disagreement turned into a notably sharp back and forth, playing out across academic journals, each side publishing new evidence, new microscope images, new statistical comparisons drawn from thousands of experimentally trampled bones. Each side convinced the other had simply misread what was sitting right in front of them. Trying to settle the matter once and for all, it's a fair question to ask yourself honestly sitting here tonight. How do you tell the difference between a deliberate cut and an accidental scrape on a bone that old using nothing but a microscope and a few thousand comparison samples? It took years and eventually a much larger, more systematic survey led by a researcher named Jessica Thompson, examining thousands of additional bones from across the wider region before the weight of evidence tipped meaningfully toward the butchery explanation. Thompson's team argued that once you looked past the handful of contested bones at the center of the original dispute and out toward the broader pattern across the whole landscape, the case for early deliberate tool use held up far better than the trampling explanation ever managed to. It's a useful reminder, honestly, of how science tends to actually work outside of documentaries and headlines. Rarely one dramatic discovery settling an argument overnight. More often a slow, patient accumulation of evidence, one stubborn disagreement at a time, until the weight of everything gathered finally tips one direction. Which means if that conclusion holds Lucy's own species, the very same small-brained, fully upright creature whose skeleton and footprints we spent time with earlier in this story may have been slicing meat off animal carcasses using sharp stones, a full 800,000 years before anyone thought tool use in any form was even possible for a creature like her. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Those same hands, freed up by walking upright long before any of this happened, weren't simply hanging idle for 1,000,000 years, waiting patiently for a bigger brain to finally show up and give them something worthwhile to do. They were already busy, picking up sharp stones, striking rock against rock, cutting into flesh that until that moment no creature without claws or fangs had ever been able to properly access on its own. There's a strange kind of thread connecting that moment to something as ordinary as the kitchen drawer sitting somewhere in your own house, right now full of knives you've probably never thought twice about. Every single blade in there dull and unremarkable, as most of them traces its ancestry back to that exact same idea. A sharp edge dragged across something soft, opening up a possibility that didn't exist a moment before. It's easy to imagine that kind of thing as purely modern, purely human, something invented rather than discovered. But the discovery part happened first, millions of years earlier, in the hands of a creature with a brain smaller than a chimpanzee's who almost certainly had no idea what they were starting. Maybe tool-making really did begin with a species we already thought we understood Lucy's own quiet, small-brained lineage doing something nobody expected of them. Maybe it belonged instead to that strange flat-faced cousin species still lurking at the edges of the fossil record waiting for someone to sort out exactly where it belongs. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest place to leave things tonight, the truth is messier than either option. Maybe more than one kind of creature in more than one corner of this same restless continent was independently discovering roughly the same idea around roughly the same time, because a sharp piece of stone, once you notice what it can do, is simply too useful an idea for evolution to only stumble onto once. Here's a question worth carrying with you as you drift towards sleep tonight. What would it feel like, do you think, to be the very first creature to ever notice that a broken rock could cut? Not understanding it exactly the way you or I would understand a tool. Just noticing in some quiet, wordless way that this jagged edge does something soft flesh and bare hands never could. Whatever the true answer turns out to be, something had clearly shifted. The long patient wait between standing upright and doing something remarkable with a free pair of hands had finally quietly come to an end. Not with a grand invention or a flash of sudden genius, just with one creature somewhere on this ancient landscape picking up the right stone at the right moment and discovering almost by accident that the world could be cut open. It's worth noticing too how ordinary that moment probably felt at the time. No one was watching. No one understood the weight of what had just happened, or the fact that this same idea, sharpened and refined across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, would eventually end up in every kitchen, every workshop, every operating room, everywhere a person alive tonight happens to be sleeping. And once that discovery existed anywhere at all, it would never fully disappear again. It would linger, get refined, get passed down, generation after patient generation, waiting for the next great pressure this restless continent had in store. A pressure written not into stone this time, but into water, into a series of lakes that kept appearing and vanishing across that same landscape, over and over for the next several million years, quietly forcing whatever was still living there to keep adapting or disappear, along with everything else that couldn't quite keep up. Water, it turns out, would end up asking a question every bit as demanding as fire or ice or a shifting mountain range. And the answer to that question is written into a stretch of Kenyan desert so dry today that it barely seems possible anything could have ever gone differently there. If you flew over the Suguta Valley this afternoon, you would see cracked pale earth stretching toward the horizon in every direction, dotted with dark volcanic cinder cones and almost nothing green at all. Heat shimmers rise off the flats by mid-morning, and what little breeze there is carries fine dust rather than any hint of moisture. Rainfall here barely clears 12 inches a year, while the sun pulls 10 times that much water straight back out of the ground through evaporation alone. It might be one of the driest, most punishing stretches of land anywhere near the equator, the sort of place where even the goats look like they're negotiating with the landscape just to survive another week. And yet, not particularly long ago, geologically speaking, that same valley held a lake nearly 1,000 feet deep. Let that sit for a moment. A lake roughly the size of several small countries combined, filling that same bone-dry basin as recently as 13,000 years ago during a stretch of unusually wet climate researchers now call the African humid period. At its highest point, this vanished body of water known today simply as Paleo Lake Suguta grew so large it eventually spilled north over a natural rock barrier and merged with the waters of Lake Turkana, one enormous connected inland sea, stretching across a landscape that today can barely support a herd of goats. Standing at the bottom of that empty valley, now surrounded by nothing but sand and dark volcanic rock, it takes a real act of imagination to picture waves once rolling across that same ground, deep enough to swallow a 30-story building whole. Then, starting around 8,500 years ago, it began disappearing. Not slowly either. Water levels dropped by hundreds of feet within a span of time that, compared to the deep, patient timelines we've been dealing with throughout this story, looks almost shockingly abrupt, a handful of centuries at most. Within a few thousand years, one of the largest lakes in the entire region had all but vanished, leaving behind only a shallow, strange mineral-crusted remnant called Lake Logipai, and mile after mile of empty ancient shoreline still faintly visible today, if you know exactly where to look. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. What do you think it would feel like living beside a lake like that, watching it slowly disappear across the span of your own lifetime, with no way of knowing whether it would ever come back? Would you keep waiting nearby, hoping the water might return the way it always had before, or would you gather up whatever you could carry and simply start walking, trusting that somewhere else, some other stretch of this restless continent still had water left to offer? As unsettling as that story is on its own, it turns out to be far from unique. Researchers piecing together the deeper climate history of this entire stretch of Africa have identified at least 3 separate episodes stretching back nearly 3 million years when massive unstable lakes like Suguta repeatedly filled and emptied across the rift, roughly around 2.7 to 2.5 million years ago, then again near 1.9 to 1.7 million years ago, and once more around 1.1 to 900,000 years ago. And here's the detail that quietly changes everything about how we interpret this pattern. Each one of those 3 episodes lines up almost too neatly to feel like coincidence with some of the most significant turning points in the entire fossil record of human evolution. So how exactly do scientists reconstruct a lake that vanished 1 million years ago, with no photographs, no written records, nothing but empty desert left behind? The answer involves drilling literally straight down into the past. Starting in the early 2010s, an international team of geologists and paleoanthropologists launched something called the Hominin Sites and Paleo Lakes Drilling Project, an effort that sounds almost absurdly ambitious once you understand what it actually involved. Picture hauling a full drilling rig, the kind you might expect to see searching for oil out across some of the most remote roadless stretches of desert in eastern Africa, then setting it up carefully enough to bore a narrow, perfectly straight hole hundreds of meters down into ground that hadn't been disturbed in over 1 million years, working across 6 separate basins in Kenya and Ethiopia, each one sitting near a site already famous for major fossil discoveries. The team drilled straight down through layer after layer of ancient lakebed sediment, eventually pulling up more than a mile combined of solid sediment core, sealed inside long cylindrical tubes and shipped back to laboratories on the other side of the world for careful, painstaking analysis. What they were really doing, in a sense, was leafing through a diary nobody had opened in over 1 million years. Each thin layer inside those cores tells researchers something specific about the world it settled through. Fine, dark, organic, rich mud generally means a deep, stable lake, once sat overhead, calm water quietly accumulating sediment year after year. Pale, chalky, mineral-heavy layers usually mean the opposite, a shallow, evaporating puddle, or dry, cracked earth exposed directly to the open sky. Tiny fossilized algae called diatoms, preserved by the thousands inside these layers, can even tell scientists roughly how deep and how salty the water sitting above them happened to be at any given moment, since different species of these microscopic organisms tend to prefer very specific conditions, deep or shallow, fresh or brackish, and simply won't show up in the record otherwise. Stack thousands of these paper-thin layers on top of each other, and you end up with something resembling a frame-by-frame recording of a lake's entire life, rising, falling, vanishing, and occasionally returning, sometimes with a resolution of a few decades at a time. One of those drill sites sits practically on top of the same ground where Lucy's own species once made its home back near Hadar. Another sits near the Tugun Hills, the same general stretch of Kenya that produced some of the very earliest fossils belonging to our own genus Homo. A third sits beside West Turkana, near enough to Lomekwi that the two stories practically share a backyard. A fourth, called Chubahir, sits further south in Ethiopia, near a valley that would later become home to some of the oldest confirmed remains of people who looked essentially like you and me, a story worth saving for its own moment later in this journey. It's hard to imagine a more direct way of asking whether the water itself had something to do with everything else that was happening on dry land nearby. And the timing lines up in a way that's remarkably hard to dismiss as coincidence. Remember that middle window we mentioned a moment ago, the stretch of wild, unstable lake activity centered around 1.8 million years ago. That exact same window happens to overlap almost precisely with one of the sharpest, fastest jumps in brain size found anywhere in the entire hominin fossil record, alongside the earliest confirmed evidence of a brand new species stepping onto the scene. Correlation, of course, is a slippery thing to lean on too heavily. It doesn't prove the lake caused the leap in brain size not on its own, but it does mean that whatever pressure was pushing brains to grow larger during that particular stretch of time, it was happening in a world where the water itself simply refused to behave. Why would a shifting, unreliable lake matter quite this much to evolution? Though I'll admit, when I first came across this idea, my instinct was to wonder how a puddle, no matter how large, could possibly outcompete a volcano or a splitting continent for evolutionary importance. But the mechanism turns out to be almost embarrassingly simple, once someone explains it properly. Here's where the shape of the land itself, the same steep, narrow trenches we spent time with earlier in this story, comes back into play in a way that's easy to miss at first. Picture pouring a modest extra cup of water onto a wide, flat dinner plate barely noticeable, spreading thin across a huge surface. Now picture pouring that exact same cup of water into a narrow drinking glass instead. Suddenly the water level rises dramatically, obviously undeniably, from a nearly identical amount of rainfall. That in miniature is roughly what the deep, narrow shape of the rift does to rainfall on a much grander scale. A relatively modest shift in regional climate, just slightly wetter or slightly drier than usual, gets amplified by the steep walls of the valley into wild, dramatic swings in lake size, sometimes rising or falling by well over 300 feet, within a stretch of time far shorter than anyone would expect from a changing climate alone. Researchers studying one particular core pulled from a basin called Lake Magadi in southern Kenya found a stretch of especially wild swings between roughly 525,000 and 400,000 years ago, the whole landscape lurching repeatedly between wet and dry within a backdrop of gradually increasing overall dryness. That same window of instability lines up with a wave of local animal extinctions and, more strikingly, with the disappearance of an old, reliable stone tool tradition that had lasted the better part of 1,000,000 years. Right around the same moment, an entirely new, more sophisticated toolkit begins showing up in the archaeological record instead. Maybe that's simply a coincidence of timing and nothing more. Or maybe, and this is the possibility more and more researchers seem willing to take seriously, an old way of surviving quietly stopped working once the lake and the landscape around it refused to hold still long enough for anyone to rely on it. It's worth noticing how this idea sits alongside a couple of theories we've already spent time with earlier in this journey. Grasslands spreading outward, broken rugged hills replacing gentle forest. Neither one on its own ever fully explained everything researchers were seeing in the fossil record. Water appearing and disappearing on a timeline too fast for comfort, and too slow for any single generation to fully adapt to, might be less a rival explanation competing against those other ideas, and more the missing thread tying several of them together. Grass spreads when a lake dries out. Hills stay broken and hard to predict, specifically because the water carving through them keeps changing its mind. Pull on any one thread of this story for long enough and it tends to bring you straight back to the same restless, unreliable rift. It's tempting, honestly, to imagine evolution as something driven mostly by the good years. Plenty of food, calm conditions, room to relax and multiply. But an unreliable lake tells a different, slightly harder story. Maybe what actually mattered wasn't the wet years or the dry years taken on their own. Maybe it was the not knowing. Generation after generation never quite certain whether the lake sustaining an entire ecosystem would still be there in 100 years, or gone completely replaced by cracked earth and drifting dust. Think about what kind of creature that sort of environment tends to favour over the very long run. Not necessarily the strongest, not necessarily the one perfectly suited to any single set of conditions, since those conditions themselves refuse to sit still long enough to reward specialization. More likely the creature capable of adjusting, of eating something different when the old food source vanished, of moving somewhere else when the water finally gave out, of remembering somehow that conditions had shifted before and might shift back again given enough patience. Would you have made it, do you think, in a world like that? Not through strength or speed or sharp teeth, but through sheer stubborn willingness to keep adjusting year after uncertain year, never quite trusting the landscape to stay the way you left it. There's a strange kind of comfort tucked inside that idea if you let yourself sit with it for a moment tonight. So much about being human, the restlessness, the endless tinkering, the refusal to simply accept whatever conditions happen to be sitting in front of us right now, might trace itself back to several million years spent beside lakes that never once gave anyone the luxury of certainty. Whatever the true balance of causes turns out to be, one thing is becoming difficult to argue with. The same restless, unpredictable rift that first split this stretch of Africa apart kept right on testing everything living inside it long after the ground itself had mostly finished moving. Not with earthquakes and lava this time, with water. Appearing and disappearing and appearing again across a timeline too slow for any single generation to notice, yet somehow leaving its fingerprints on nearly every major turn this story has taken so far. It's a strange thing to picture, honestly, lying here tonight. Somewhere underneath the comfort of your own steady, reliable routine, there's a distant echo of ancestors who never once got to take stability for granted, who built an entire way of surviving around the simple, exhausting habit of expecting the ground beneath their feet to eventually change on them again, And all of that uncertainty, all that scrambling to adjust to remember to keep finding food when the easy sources kept vanishing without warning, was about to place an enormous demand on one particular organ tucked quietly inside a skull that up until now had stayed roughly the same modest size for millions of years running. Because staying flexible enough to survive a world this unpredictable does not come free. It costs energy, a great deal of it. And the next part of this story is about exactly where our ancestors found the fuel to pay that bill, and what it cost them permanently to keep affording it. Paying that particular bill would end up falling quite literally on the shoulders of a young Homo erectus, whose bones a self-taught fossil hunter stumbled across on an ordinary Sunday morning in August of 1984 on the dry western shore of Lake Turkana. His name was Kamoya Kimiu, and honestly his own story deserves a moment of attention before we even get to what he found. Kimiu grew up in rural southeastern Kenya, and his formal schooling never made it past the 6th grade. None of that stopped him from developing one of the sharpest eyes for fossils anywhere in the world, an ability that seemed to run less on formal training and more on sheer patient familiarity with the land itself, the kind of knowledge that comes from spending years studying the colour and texture of soil, the way another person might study a well-loved book. Starting out as a field excavator for Louis and Mary Leakey, back in 1960, Kimiu went on to personally locate dozens of the most significant hominin fossils ever recovered from African soil, earning himself leadership of the excavation team other researchers simply nicknamed the Hominid Gang. On that particular morning, walking along a dry seasonal riverbed near Lake Turkana under the flat, early heat of an August sun, he noticed a small dark fragment of skull barely bigger than a matchbox catching the light differently than the surrounding stone scattered around it. Nobody expected what came next. As the excavation slowly expanded outward from that single fragment, more and more of the skeleton kept emerging from the ground over the following weeks. A jaw, ribs, a pelvis, long straight leg bones still lying in roughly the same position they'd settled into so long ago. By the time the dig finished, researchers had recovered roughly 40% of an entire skeleton, an astonishing yield for anything this old belonging to a young Homo erectus who had died somewhere around 1.5 million years ago. To this day, it remains the most complete skeleton of that species ever found anywhere on the planet. Here's why this particular fossil matters so much to the question we're circling around tonight. Compared to Lucy's kind, whose bones we spent time with earlier in this story, this skeleton belonged to a body built almost unrecognizably differently. Where Lucy's chest flared outward into a cone shape closer to a chimpanzee's, this skeleton had a narrower, straighter, barrel-shaped chest. Where Lucy's arms hung long and curved, built at least partly for climbing this skeleton's proportions, looked remarkably similar to a modern human's long legs, efficient stride, a body clearly built for covering serious ground on foot, rather than retreating into branches when trouble arrived. Even the lower back had changed, settling into the same gentle curve your own spine still carries. Today a curve Lucy's kind never quite had. Researchers still argue gently over exactly what to call this particular population, some preferring the name Homo erectus, others insisting the African branch deserves its own separate label, Homo ergaster reserving erectus for slightly later populations that eventually spread into Asia. It's a fairly small technical disagreement in the grand scheme of things, the kind of naming debate that matters enormously to specialists and barely at all to the actual story this skeleton is telling. Whatever label eventually wins out, the bones themselves aren't waiting around for scientists to agree on what to call them. And then there's the brain, roughly 880 cubic centimeters, once fully grown, more than double the size of a chimpanzee's, and well over twice the size of Lucy's small grapefruit-sized brain from several million years earlier. Still nowhere near the size of yours, resting quietly inside your own skull right now, closer to a third smaller than the average modern human brain. But an unmistakable leap forward all the same, arriving alongside a body finally built for the kind of active, wide-ranging life that comes with feeding a brain that demanding, which raises an uncomfortable question nobody in this story has had to properly reckon with until now. Not the rift, not the lakes, not even the sharpest stone tool anyone had shaped so far. Brains, it turns out, are spectacularly expensive to run. In modern humans, a brain that makes up roughly 2% of total body weight quietly burns through nearly 20% of the body's entire energy budget, simply idling, simply existing. Whether you're solving a difficult problem or lying perfectly still in bed, picture your own brain right now as you drift towards sleep, still humming away like a light left burning in an otherwise empty house all night, using nearly a quarter of the electricity in the whole building just to keep one small room lit. So where exactly did a bigger, hungrier brain like this one find the extra fuel to keep itself running in a world already this unpredictable? In 1995, two researchers, Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler, proposed an answer that still shapes this entire conversation today. They noticed something curious comparing human anatomy against other primates of similar body size. Our digestive systems are noticeably smaller than you'd expect, given how large our bodies are, overall roughly 60% smaller than a similarly sized primate relying on a typical ape diet of fruit and leaves. Digestive tissue, much like brain tissue, happens to be extremely costly to maintain, constantly working, constantly demanding energy, whether or not it's actively digesting anything at that particular moment. Aiello and Wheeler's proposal, which became known as the expensive tissue hypothesis, suggested these two facts were directly connected. As diet shifted toward richer, more energy-dense food meat, especially the gut no longer needed to be quite so large or so demanding, freeing up a meaningful chunk of the body's overall energy budget, and that freed up energy, they argued, could then be redirected somewhere else entirely, toward a brain that was just beginning gradually, generation after generation, to grow. It's an elegant idea, honestly. The kind of explanation that feels almost too satisfying once you hear it laid out properly, which is usually exactly the moment a good scientist starts poking holes in it. And sure enough, not everyone found the expensive tissue hypothesis fully convincing. One researcher, examining a much broader dataset spanning dozens of different mammal species rather than just primates, found no consistent relationship at all between brain size and gut size across the wider animal kingdom, and suggested somewhat bluntly that it might be time to say goodbye to the idea altogether. Aiello and Wheeler, for their part, have pushed back, arguing their original proposal was always specifically about human and primate evolution, never intended as some universal law stretched across every mammal on the planet. The debate more than 3 decades later still hasn't fully settled either way, which tells you something honest about how this entire field actually works. Elegant ideas rarely survive their first serious argument fully intact, and the ones that do usually come out sturdier and more carefully worded for having survived it. Here's a question worth turning over for a moment, honestly, before we go any further. If a bigger brain really did need richer food to fuel it, what do you imagine actually made that food rich enough in the first place? Simply killing an animal and eating it raw only gets you so far. Muscle fiber, sinew, tough, raw meat takes an enormous amount of chewing and digesting to break down and extract much value from it all. Would you have guessed before tonight that the answer might have less to do with what our ancestors managed to catch, and more to do with something as simple as what they eventually learned to do with it afterward? Which brings us to fire and to a cave sitting near the edge of the Kalahari Desert in South Africa called Wonderwerk. The cave itself stretches back more than 100 meters into a low limestone hillside, dark and cool, inside even under the harshest desert sun, outside the kind of place that would have offered shelter to anyone or anything willing to venture deep enough into it. Researchers working inside that cave uncovered something remarkable, buried in a layer of sediment dated to roughly 1 million years old. Microscopic traces of ash from burned plants, tiny fragments of bone scorched and discoloured in patterns that only happen when something is directly, deliberately exposed to fire rather than simply caught downwind of a distant wildfire sweeping past outside. The team studying the site went to considerable lengths, ruling out other explanations, confirming the burning almost certainly happened right there deep inside the cave itself, rather than being carried in afterward by blowing air or water. For years, this stood as the earliest secure evidence anywhere in the world of a hominin deliberately controlling fire. There's a fascinating twist to this part of the story, though, one that says something wonderful about how science occasionally gets ahead of its own evidence. Back in 2009, years before that wonderwork analysis was even published, a Harvard primatologist named Richard Wrangham had already argued in a book called Catching Fire that cooking specifically, not simply meat, must have been the real spark behind the leap from smaller-brained ancestors into Homo erectus. Working almost entirely from anatomy, rather than ash, comparing jaw size, tooth size, gut proportions and energy requirements, Wrangham confidently proposed a date for when fire must have entered the picture, roughly 1.8 million years ago. At the time, he had no direct archaeological evidence anywhere near that old to point to, and plenty of colleagues considered the claim more than a little premature. And here's the update worth sharing tonight, because this particular story keeps getting older even now. Researchers returning to Wonderwerk quite recently using a newer, more sensitive technique for examining how ancient bone reacts to heat, found signs suggesting fire may indeed have been in use inside that same cave, as far back as 1.8 million years ago, nearly doubling the original confirmed timeline and landing remarkably near the exact number Wrangham had proposed from anatomy alone more than a decade earlier. Science, as we've noticed more than once already tonight, rarely stays settled for very long, and every so often a bold guess quietly turns out to have been ahead of its time. Think about what a controlled fire would have actually meant for a creature already struggling to fuel an increasingly hungry brain. Cooked meat breaks down far more easily than raw meat, releasing more usable energy for less digestive effort, essentially doing a meaningful portion of the gut's exhausting work before a single bite ever reaches the stomach. Researchers who study this closely point out something almost comical about the alternative. Chewing enough raw meat and fibrous plants to properly fuel a modern human brain would take hours upon hours of continuous exhausting jaw work every single day, more time spent chewing than most of us spend at our actual jobs, leaving precious little daylight left over for anything else. Hunting, resting, raising the next generation, let alone sitting quietly beside a fire, thinking about anything much at all. Fire also meant warmth through cold nights, protection from predators who understandably keep their distance from flame, and perhaps just as importantly, something researchers studying Wonderwerk have pointed toward directly. A reason to gather together in one place after dark. Have you ever noticed how a fire still pulls people together tonight? Even now, even when nobody actually needs it for warmth or protection anymore. There's something almost stubbornly old about that pull, older than language, older than any story ever told beside one. Isn't there something quietly moving about that idea long before language, long before anything resembling a story told out loud? There may already have been small groups of ancestors sitting together around a fire at night doing essentially in some rough, wordless way exactly what you're doing with me right now. Maybe it really was the shift toward meat that unlocked the extra fuel a growing brain demanded. Maybe fire and the cooking it eventually made possible deserves most of the credit, instead arriving earlier than anyone could prove until very recently. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest place to leave it before we move on, tonight, both ideas are only pieces of a puzzle nobody has fully assembled, yet meat providing richer raw material fire, making that material easier still to extract value from each discovery, quietly making the next one just a little more affordable, one small advantage compounding on top of another, until almost without anyone noticing exactly when it happened, A brain that size finally became something this restless landscape could actually afford to keep. Whatever the precise sequence turns out to have been, something had clearly shifted by the time this particular skeleton, discovered by a sharp-eyed man with a 6th grade education and an extraordinary gift for noticing what everyone else walked straight past, came to rest near the shore of Lake Turkana. A taller body, a hungrier brain, a diet and quite possibly a fire finally rich enough to keep pace with it. It's worth sitting with the sheer improbability of that chain of events for a moment tonight. An unpredictable landscape demanding flexibility. Flexibility demanding fuel, arriving through meat and eventually flame. And flame, almost as an afterthought, quietly teaching a species to sit still together after dark. But a bigger brain and a controlled flame still don't fully explain something else the fossil record was quietly revealing during roughly this same stretch of time. Because this hungry, fire-tending, meat-eating creature was not the only kind of upright, tool-using being wandering across this restless continent. Not by a long stretch. For a while, several strikingly different branches of this same family tree were living and surviving, and occasionally crossing paths all at once in ways that raise an entirely different question about what it actually means to belong to the same story. Occasionally crossing paths turns out to be far more literal than you might expect. In one remarkable case discovered only a few years ago, 2 different kinds of ancient human relative left footprints on the exact same stretch of muddy lake shore within hours of each other 1.5 million years ago. Not fossils buried in separate layers decades or centuries apart the way most of this story has unfolded so far. Actual footsteps sitting side by side, practically closer in time than your own footprints from this morning, are to the ones you'll leave walking to bed tonight. Let's start there, because it might be the single most direct piece of evidence anywhere in this entire story. In 2021, a field and laboratory assistant named Richard Loki was working at Kubifora on the eastern edge of Lake Turkana in Kenya, helping excavate a site already scheduled for other fossil discoveries, when he noticed something pressed into an ancient layer of hardened mud. Footprints. Preserved almost impossibly well in sediment that had once sat at the soft waterlogged edge of an ancient lake, later buried compressed, and finally exposed again by patient erosion more than 1 million years later. The team overseeing the excavation was led by Louise Leakey, granddaughter of the same Louis and Mary Leakey, whose names have quietly threaded their way through nearly every part of this story so far, continuing a family legacy of fossil hunting, now stretching across 3 generations. When specialists eventually examined the prints closely, working carefully to avoid damaging edges so crisp they looked almost freshly made rather than 1.5 million years old, they noticed something nobody expected. 2 distinctly different walking styles pressed into the same surface, clearly made within a short window of each other, before either set of tracks had time to dry out or wash away. One trackway showed a long fluid stride weight rolling smoothly from heel to toe, the same efficient walking pattern you'd expect from a body built like Turkana boys, the kind of Homo erectus anatomy we spent time with earlier in this story. The other told a completely different story. Shorter steps. A markedly different distribution of weight across the foot. A gait researchers now believe likely belonged to Paranthropus boisei, a heavily built, small-brained cousin species with an entirely separate way of moving through the world. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. What do you imagine that encounter might have actually looked like? 2 entirely different kinds of upright tool-using, being sharing the exact same muddy shoreline, quite possibly within the very same afternoon, each one going about whatever ordinary business filled an ordinary day 1.5 million years ago. Did they notice each other at all? Keep a wary distance, or simply move past one another, the way 2 different species of bird might share the same patch of shoreline today, each one entirely absorbed in its own version of an ordinary afternoon, This wasn't some rare one-off coincidence either. The wider fossil record from the same region, painstakingly assembled across more than 50 years of careful excavation, paints a picture that would have seemed almost unbelievable to earlier generations of researchers. At various points across roughly 1 million years, this single stretch of shoreline was home to at least 3, and quite possibly 4 distinctly different species of hominin, sometimes living, and evidently sometimes literally walking across the very same landscape at the very same moment. Paranthropus boisei, the heavily built cousin species we're about to spend more time with. Homo habilis, smaller-brained and generally considered among the earliest confirmed members of our own genus. Homo erectus, taller, leaner, the same species Turkana boy belonged to. And depending on which researcher you happen to ask, quite possibly a 4th species entirely, Homo rudolfensis, known mainly from a single, well-preserved skull, its exact place on the family tree still debated to this day. It's worth pausing here to correct a mental picture plenty of people carry around without ever questioning it. That familiar image, a single, confident line of figures marching left to right across a poster-hunched ape, gradually straightening into upright human, each one a tidy stepping stone toward the next, suggesting one continuous single-file journey toward us. Have you ever actually seen that poster hanging somewhere? A office wall, a science classroom, a t-shirt at a museum gift shop, and simply assumed it was more or less accurate? Most people have. It might be one of the most widely recognized and most thoroughly misleading images in all of popular science. The actual fossil record looks nothing like that tidy line. It looks more like a thick tangled bush with several branches growing outward at once, most of them eventually snapping off entirely, and only one particular branch, ours, still standing today, somewhat improbably given how crowded that bush once was. One of the most striking branches belonged to a creature whose story began on an ordinary July morning in 1959 at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. Louis Leakey had woken up feeling unwell that day, so his wife Mary went out alone to continue their survey work, walking a gully the two of them had already combed over dozens of times before, without finding much of anything worth remembering. Sometime around 11 in the morning, she spotted a fragment of skull poking out from the gully wall, a small piece of bone catching just enough morning light to stand out from the pale surrounding rock. Careful excavation over the following weeks revealed an almost complete cranium with an enormous heavy jaw and a distinct bony ridge running along the top of the skull. Exactly the kind of anchor point you'd expect for powering seriously oversized chewing muscles. They initially gave the specimen its own dramatic name, calling it Zinjanthropus, and the skull quickly earned a nickname that stuck far longer than the formal classification ever did: Nutcracker Man. With molars roughly twice the size of yours, a jaw built like heavy machinery, and males considerably larger than females. Some of the biggest individuals standing perhaps a little over 4 feet tall, but built stocky and powerful, all muscle and bone dedicated almost entirely to the business of chewing. Researchers assumed the obvious explanation. This creature must have specialized in cracking open exactly the kind of tough hard foods its name implies: nut seeds, anything requiring serious grinding power to break down. For decades, that assumption simply sat there unquestioned, repeated in textbook after textbook, museum placard after museum placard. Then a University of Utah research team decided to actually test it directly, examining the chemical signature locked inside the tooth enamel of more than 20 individuals belonging to this same species. Here's roughly how that works, in case you've ever wondered how anyone could possibly know what a creature ate 1 million years after its last meal. Different types of plants absorb carbon from the air in subtly different ways depending on how they photosynthesize, and that subtle chemical difference gets built directly into the enamel of whatever eats them, locked in place essentially forever once a tooth finishes forming. It's a little like every meal leaving behind an invisible, unerasable receipt, filed away permanently inside your own teeth. carbon isotopes absorbed from whatever plants an animal actually eats over the course of its life, leave a distinct fingerprint behind in tooth enamel, one that lingers for millions of years after everything else about that creature has long since disappeared. The results overturn decades of assumption in one clean stroke. Nutcracker man, it turns out, was hardly cracking any nuts at all. The chemistry pointed overwhelmingly toward tropical grasses and marsh sedges instead, making up somewhere near 3/4 of this creature's entire diet, among the highest proportion of grass-based eating ever recorded for any hominin species examined, so far higher even than species built with far less impressive chewing equipment. All that formidable jaw strength, all those massive grinding molars seem to have evolved less for cracking open the occasional hard shell, and more for the endless grinding, unglamorous work of chewing through mouthful after mouthful of tough, fibrous grass day after day for years on end. Not a nutcracker at all in the end. Something closer to a very well-equipped, very patient lawnmower. Isn't it a little humbling, honestly? Imagining an entire species walking around for more than 1,000,000 years, quietly misunderstood by everyone studying its bones, simply because a name given in a moment of 1950s enthusiasm happened to stick a little too well. Somewhere a very confident museum placard from decades ago is presumably still describing Nutcracker man exactly backward, and nobody has gotten around to fixing it yet. Paranthropus boisei, as the species eventually came to be properly known, survived for well over 1,000,000 years across this same stretch of eastern Africa, evidently sharing space with at least 2 and sometimes 3 separate species belonging to our own genus Homo at various overlapping points along the way. In 2007, Louise Leakey's mother Meave led a study examining 2 newly uncovered fossils from this same Cubifora region, a jawbone and a small skull, each one carefully compared against the existing record of the 2 species, long assumed to represent a tidy one, after the other succession, Homo habilis, quietly evolving into Homo erectus over time. The new fossils told a different story. The jawbone confirmed that Homo habilis was still very much alive at a point in time well after Homo erectus had already appeared on the scene, while the small skull turned out to belong to a surprisingly compact individual of Homo erectus, overlapping in size with its supposedly more primitive cousin. Rather than one species patiently transforming into the next, the evidence pointed toward both species living alongside each other, sharing the same lake basin for something nearing 500,000 years, an entire 500,000 years of overlap that older textbooks had simply never accounted for. It's worth remembering too that this wasn't the first time this particular family had upended a tidy assumption about how many species belonged on this landscape at once. A few years earlier, this same research team had also identified a separate, previously unknown 3.5-million-year-old skull from further west, distinct enough from Lucy's kind to warrant its own entirely new genus, adding yet another crowded branch to a tree that kept turning out to be far bushier than anyone had originally assumed. So why, out of this entire crowded family tree branch after branch, competing, coexisting, occasionally crossing paths on the very same muddy shoreline, did only one lineage ultimately make it all the way through to tonight? Nobody has a complete answer, but there's a clue worth connecting back to something we spent real time with earlier in this story. Remember the lakes appearing and disappearing across this same restless landscape, sometimes within a single human lifetime, rewriting the rules of survival, again and again with almost no warning at all. A species like Paranthropus boisei, having committed itself so thoroughly to one narrow specialized way of eating, chewing tough grass hour after hour, with jaws built for exactly that single purpose, may have been left with remarkably little room to improvise once the grass itself became unreliable, or once a shrinking lake shrank the very meadows it depended on. A body built as a masterpiece of specialization is also quietly a body with very few other options once that one specialty stops paying off. Meanwhile, the branch that eventually became us kept doing something altogether messier and evidently far more useful. Eating meat when meat was available, digging up roots when it wasn't, cooking, gathering, adapting, borrowing whatever the moment happened to require rather than perfecting one single skill at the expense of every other option. Not the strongest jaw on the landscape, not the most efficient digestion, not even by most measures available at the time the most physically impressive of the various cousins sharing this same crowded shoreline. Just apparently the most willing to keep changing its mind. Maybe specialization itself is what eventually doomed Nutcracker Man and its relatives, a body built brilliantly for one specific narrow world left stranded once that world stopped holding still. Maybe direct competition for shrinking resources played a larger role than anyone can currently prove. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest place to leave it, before we move on tonight, it was simply chance and accumulation of small, unremarkable decisions and lucky breaks, repeated across hundreds of thousands of years, that could easily have tipped a different direction entirely, leaving some other branch of this crowded, tangled bush standing here instead of ours. There's something worth sitting with in that thought tonight as you drift towards sleep. For well over 1 million years, being human or something near to it was never a solitary journey walked by one confident line of ancestors, marching steadily forward. It was crowded, competitive, occasionally literally crossing paths on the same muddy afternoon, with cousins who looked moved and ate in ways strikingly different from your own. Every one of us alive tonight descends from the single branch that happened to keep bending and adjusting, rather than the ones that grew perfectly suited to a world that sooner or later always finds a way to change on you. It's a strange kind of inheritance, honestly, when you think about it properly. Not a straight, tidy line handed down carefully from one confident ancestor to the next, but the last surviving branch of something far messier, a family reunion nobody planned. Most of the relatives long gone, leaving one lineage standing simply because it never quite settled into one comfortable, permanent way of doing things. And that flexible, endlessly adjusting branch was about to be tested in an entirely new way. Because somewhere in this same crowded landscape a face was quietly forming that would eventually force scientists to rewrite once again almost everything they thought they understood about how that one surviving branch actually got here. That face had actually been waiting inside a drawer of unlabeled fragments for years before anyone realized what they were holding. There's something oddly moving about that if you sit with it for a moment before we go any further tonight. An actual face belonging to an actual individual who once blinked against actual sunlight on this same stretch of Ethiopian riverbed, broken into pieces small enough to lose track of, waiting quietly in storage while the rest of the world moved on entirely unaware. The story starts at a site called Gona, tucked into the same broad sun-baked stretch of Ethiopia's Afar region that has already come up more than once tonight, not far from where Lucy once rested, and near enough to Dikika that the same ancient river system likely once connected them. Gona holds its own quiet claim to fame in this story too. It's one of the places where researchers first uncovered some of the oldest confirmed Oldowan stone tools anywhere in the world, dated to roughly 2.5 million years old. In other words, this single stretch of Ethiopian riverbed has now handed scientists evidence spanning tool use, walking, feeding behavior, and as it turns out, one of the most confusing faces in the entire human fossil record. The project responsible for all of it, co-directed for decades by researchers Silashi Semau and Michael Rogers, has spent so long combing this same patch of ground that its published fossil catalogue now stretches back more than 6 million years. An almost absurd depth of history quietly buried underneath what looks from the surface like nothing more than dry, unremarkable desert. Researchers first pulled fragments of a skull out of the ground here back in the early 2000s, and by 2020 they'd pieced together enough of the brain case to confidently identify it as belonging to a small female Homo erectus, dated to somewhere between 1.5 and 1.6 million years old. That alone would have been a solid, respectable contribution to the fossil record. The matter settled more or less, or so it seemed at the time, except the face was still sitting there unassembled in dozens of shattered fragments, too damaged and scattered to make sense of using older methods. It would take several more years and a very different kind of expertise before anyone managed to put it back together properly. A paleoanthropologist named Karen Babb, working with an international team of specialists spread across several countries and institutions, took on the job of finishing what that fragmentary skull had started. It's worth picturing what that job actually looked like in practice, because it sounds almost impossibly tedious when you slow down and think about it properly. Dozens of facial bone fragments, some barely larger than a fingernail, along with a handful of surviving teeth, none of them arriving with any sort of instruction manual attached. Using detailed CT scans, her team built a digital three-dimensional model of every single facial fragment, and tooth recovered from the site then carefully fitted those pieces together, virtually the way you might reassemble a shattered vase from a box of unlabeled shards. Except this particular vase had been sitting broken in the ground for 1.5 million years, and nobody had a picture on the box to work from. Once the digital face was complete, the team attached it to the previously reconstructed brain case and stepped back to see for the first time what this individual had actually looked like. What stared back at them didn't quite match anyone's expectations. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. If someone told you a skull's brain case belonged unmistakably to Homo erectus, the same tall, efficient fire-tending species we spent real time with earlier tonight, what kind of face would you assume went along with it? Take a second and actually picture it, the way you might picture a stranger's face just from hearing their voice on the phone. A sloped forehead, maybe heavy brows, a face already halfway towards something you'd recognize walking past you on a street today. Whatever you just pictured, this one probably looked a little different. The brain case itself checked out perfectly, matching the classic Homo erectus pattern researchers already knew well. But the face attached to it looked, in the researchers' own careful wording, unexpectedly primitive. A flat, low nasal bridge, unusually large molars, proportions that on their own would have looked far more at home on an older, more ancestral species called Homo habilis, one generally considered a full evolutionary step behind Homo erectus on the family tree. A modern brain case essentially wearing what looked like an older model's face. There's another layer worth mentioning here, one that stretches this discovery's importance well beyond a single reconstructed face. Homo erectus is widely credited as the first member of this family to successfully spread beyond Africa altogether, eventually turning up in fossil deposits as far away as Southeast Asia and the Caucasus Mountains. Which means whatever this particular population in Ethiopia actually looked like, primitive face modern brain case, or some blended combination of both, may say something meaningful about what those first travellers carried with them as they left. A face this archaic, surviving this late in this particular corner of Africa, quietly raises the possibility that the version of Homo erectus which eventually walked out across 3 continents may never have looked quite as uniform or quite as settled as the tidy museum reconstructions usually suggest. There's another detail that makes this particular reconstruction worth taking especially seriously. This individual represents the very first complete skull of this specific time period, roughly 1.5 million years ago, ever recovered from the entire Horn of Africa. Not a fragment. Not a partial jaw or a lone tooth, the kind of scattered evidence most of this era of human history has to rely on. A complete connected face and brain case belonging to one single individual, offering a level of detail researchers studying this narrow window of time had simply never had access to before. Isn't that a strange thing to sit with tonight? A single individual 1.5 million years old wearing 2 different chapters of the same story on one skull. The modern half of the family looking out through eyes set into a face that belonged by all appearances to something older. It's a little like discovering a house built with a perfectly up-to-date roof, resting on foundations laid a full generation earlier, both parts entirely real, entirely functional, simply never quite finished catching up with each other. For decades, textbooks have leaned on a fairly tidy assumption about what Homo erectus actually looked like, largely built around famous well-preserved specimens like Turkana boy, whose bones we spent time with earlier in this story. Tall body, efficient stride, a face that had already moved noticeably away from its more ancestral cousins. It's worth remembering that Turkana boy himself belonged to a somewhat later population considerably further south and east than this individual from Gona, which might partly explain the difference. But it might not. And that small nagging uncertainty is precisely what makes this discovery so interesting. This new reconstruction complicates the tidy picture considerably, suggesting the very definition of what counted as a typical Homo erectus face might have been more variable, more of a loose cluster of overlapping possibilities than any single tidy textbook illustration or any one famous skeleton could ever properly capture. So how does a creature end up with a brain case from one chapter of the story, and a face from an earlier one? Researchers studying this particular puzzle have proposed a couple of fascinating explanations, and true to form for nearly everything we've covered tonight, they don't fully agree with each other yet. One idea suggests this particular population might have descended from an earlier group that had already left Africa roughly 300,000 years before this individual was even born, wandered for a while somewhere across Eurasia, then eventually made its way back home carrying along a slightly older, more conservative version of the Homo erectus face. The whole time, almost like a small isolated pocket of the family that never quite got the memo everyone else back home had already received. Picture a distant relative returning from decades abroad, still dressed in fashions everyone else quietly stopped wearing, years earlier utterly unaware that anything had changed while they were gone. The other idea, and this one might be the more startling of the two, raises the possibility of actual interbreeding. Two closely related but distinct populations, one looking more like classic Homo erectus, the other retaining older Homo habilis-like features, meeting somewhere along this same restless landscape and quietly blending their features together in a single lineage. If that second idea sounds oddly familiar, it should. It's essentially the same story we now know happened much later between our own species and the Neanderthals' borrowed genes and blended faces showing up generations after two, once separate populations happened to cross paths. Except here we're talking about it potentially happening well over 1 million years earlier, between two branches of humanity, so ancient neither one had even learned to control fire with any confidence yet. One of the researchers involved in the project, a co-director of the wider excavation effort at Gona, put it about as honestly as any scientist ever manages to admitting that untangling this particular mystery will likely require several more fossils dated to roughly the same narrow window of time before anyone can say with real confidence which explanation actually holds up. Which is, if you think about it, a wonderfully humble thing for a group of scientists to admit publicly, right alongside a discovery dramatic enough to make international headlines the moment it was announced. We found something remarkable, and we still aren't entirely sure what it means. Try saying that sentence out loud at your own job sometime and see how your manager reacts. There's something worth connecting here to an idea we spent real time with just a little while ago in this story about how messy and tangled the actual human family tree turns out to be once you look closely enough. It's tempting to assume that once a species gets a tidy scientific name, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, whatever label happens to stick, that name describes something clean and fixed. One consistent set of features shared by every individual who ever wore it, the way a single breed of dog is expected to look roughly the same whether it's standing in a backyard in Ohio or Osaka. This new face suggests something far stranger. Even inside a single named species spread across a single connected river system in Ethiopia, individuals could carry noticeably different combinations of old and new traits, blurring the line between one chapter of this story and the last in ways no simple family tree diagram could ever fully capture. Maybe this particular population really did wander off, isolate itself for a few 100,000 years, and quietly hold on to an older face while the rest of the family moved on without them. Maybe two distinct populations met somewhere along this landscape and blended together in ways we're only now learning to recognize in fossils this old. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest place to leave it before we move on, tonight the truth is something researchers haven't even proposed yet, waiting patiently in some unopened fragment of rock, somewhere in this same restless stretch of Ethiopia, for the next careful pair of hands to notice it and rewrite this particular page of the story all over again. It's worth remembering too tonight of all nights that this particular reconstruction only became possible because of tools that didn't exist a generation ago. Digital scanning, virtual reassembly, the patient work of matching broken fragments. No human eye could have reliably pieced together by hand. 20 years ago, this same box of shattered fragments would likely have sat quietly in a museum drawer, indefinitely technically catalogued, practically unreadable, waiting for a kind of technology nobody working at the time could have fully anticipated, let alone requested funding for. Which means, honestly, this almost certainly won't be the last time an old familiar fossil gets a completely new face. Somewhere in a museum drawer right now, another shattered skull is quietly waiting for the right technology and the right pair of patient hands to finally put it back together properly, possibly overturning some other tidy assumption researchers currently consider settled. It raises a fair question worth carrying with you tonight. How many other confident textbook illustrations, the ones showing one clean single face representing an entire species, are quietly waiting for their own version of this correction, sitting in some drawer, some storage crate, some overlooked corner of a collection nobody has revisited in decades? Science, as we've noticed more than once tonight, already rarely finishes a chapter as cleanly as it first appears to, and every settled answer seems to come with a quiet, patient asterisk attached, waiting for whoever looks next. But faces and brain cases and blended features tell only part of this story. Because not every branch of this crowded, tangled family tree needed a large brain at all to pull off something remarkable. Somewhere else on this same continent, in a cave system so difficult to reach that researchers still argue about how anyone managed to get inside it at all, a very different, very small-brained cousin was about to challenge nearly everything scientists thought they understood about what it actually takes to behave like something more than an animal. On the night of September 13th, 2013, an accountant with a passion for recreational caving found himself squeezing sideways through a crack in solid rock, barely 7 inches wide, jagged edges catching on his overalls with every inch of forward progress. His name was Stephen Tucker, and he'd explored this same cave system more than 20 times before without ever noticing this particular crevice existed. That night, simply trying to get out of his caving partner's way while the two of them searched for an unrelated route, he stepped sideways, almost by accident, shone his headlamp down into the narrow gap, and realized he couldn't see the bottom. What would you do in that exact moment? Most sensible people would probably turn around right there. If you've ever felt your chest tighten just walking into a crowded elevator, take a second to imagine what that same instinct would have been screaming at Tucker, alone in the dark with no cell signal and no easy way back up. Tucker, along with his caving partner Rick Hunter, kept going anyway. The crack led downward into a passage so tight in places that anyone carrying even a modest amount of body fat would have simply gotten stuck. A stretch cavers eventually nicknamed Superman's Crawl, since the only way through involved holding one arm stretched forward and the other pinned tightly against your side, exactly the posture of a cartoon superhero flying through the air. Beyond that came a second obstacle, a near vertical chute barely wide enough for a single shoulder to pass through, at a time stretching nearly 40 feet straight down through solid rock into complete darkness, the kind of drop where a wrong twist of the hips could mean spending a very uncomfortable night wedged in place waiting for help, that would take hours to arrive, even in the best circumstances. Only after clearing both of those did Tucker finally drop into an open chamber, stalactites hanging quietly overhead, dust from thousands of undisturbed years still settling around his boots, and swing his headlamp across the floor. Bones scattered everywhere, including unmistakably half of a skull. Tucker and Hunter photographed what they'd found, and brought the images to a paleoanthropologist named Lee Berger at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, a researcher who had already spent 2 decades combing this same general region of South Africa, an area so rich in early human fossils it had long ago earned the nickname the Cradle of Humankind, a title that by this point in tonight's story might be starting to feel like it belongs to more than one single stretch of ground across this entire continent. Berger recognized immediately that whatever sat inside that chamber was worth taking seriously. He also recognized a problem. Nobody on his existing team could physically fit through a gap that Narrow himself very much included, so he did something wonderfully practical about it. In October of that same year, Berger posted a public call-out quite literally on social media, openly asking for qualified excavators who happened to be slim enough and comfortable enough with tight spaces to navigate a passage most people would consider utterly terrifying. It's probably one of the more unusual job postings in the history of paleoanthropology, somewhere between a scientific recruitment notice and an invitation to attempt something most sane adults would actively avoid. Within a few weeks, he'd assembled a team of 6 women scientists: Marina Elliott Lindsay, Eves, Ellen Feuerriegel, Aliyah Gurtoff, Hannah Morris, and Becca Peixoto, a group the rest of the expedition affectionately started calling the underground astronauts, on account of spending weeks working in conditions nearly as isolated, cramped and physically demanding as an actual space mission, communicating with the surface team through miles of carefully laid cable strung back through those same impossible passages. Berger himself, notably too broad in the shoulders to follow them down, spent much of the excavation watching remotely through a video feed directing work he physically could not have done himself. Over the following weeks, that small team recovered more than 1,500 individual bone fragments from the chamber floor and the excavation pit beneath it, representing at least 15 separate individuals ranging from infants to elderly adults. By any measure, it remains one of the largest single collections of early human fossils ever recovered from anywhere on the African continent, an entire population's worth of evidence pulled from a single impossibly cramped room. In 2015, once the analysis was complete, this newly identified species finally got a name. Homo naledi, borrowing the word for star from the local Sesotho language, a quiet nod to the cave where it had waited undisturbed for longer than anyone could have guessed, and a name that once you learn it has a habit of sticking somewhere in the back of your mind for a very long time afterward. Here's where the story stops being simply an impressive discovery and starts becoming something remarkably strange. Homo naledi's brain measured somewhere between 450 and 610 cubic centimeters, roughly a third the size of yours sitting quietly inside your own skull right now. That figure sits nearer to Lucy's small ape-sized brain from millions of years earlier than to anything belonging to our own species. The hands showed a similar mix of old and new curved fingers, built for climbing, sitting alongside a thumb and wrist, remarkably well suited for careful, precise manipulation, the kind of grip you'd want for threading a needle rather than swinging through branches. The feet and legs, meanwhile, looked almost entirely modern, built for confident, efficient upright walking across long distances, a set of legs that would not have looked especially out of place on a hiking trail today. A small, ancient-looking brain riding on top of a body that from the collarbones down could almost pass for something walking around today. If you'd only heard that description so far, you might reasonably assume researchers were describing something from deep in this story, somewhere back alongside Lucy, or the earliest stone tool makers we spent time with several chapters ago. Here's the detail that turned this entire discovery upside down. When researchers finally managed to date the fossils, they didn't rely on a single method and simply hope for the best. Multiple independent teams applied several different dating techniques at once, measuring the slow radioactive decay of uranium trapped inside nearby mineral growths, tracking the accumulated radiation damage locked inside the teeth themselves, and cross-checking both against the surrounding sediment. When every single method kept landing in roughly the same narrow window, researchers had little choice but to accept a result that, by all accounts, left more than one experienced scientist quietly staring at their own data in disbelief. Somewhere between 236,000 and 335,000 years old. Sit with that figure for a moment, because it matters enormously. That places Homo naledi roughly in the same general window of time as some of the very earliest confirmed fossils of our own species, Homo sapiens, emerging elsewhere across this same continent. Which means, for a stretch of tens of thousands of years, at minimum, a small-brained, climbing-fingered, deeply ancient-looking cousin species may have been sharing the African landscape with people whose brains had already grown to something nearing modern size. Would you have guessed before tonight that something this primitive-looking managed to survive that recently quietly overlapping with the earliest chapters of our own species' story? For decades, one assumption sat quietly underneath nearly every conversation about human evolution, including a fair amount of what we've covered together already tonight. Big brains. The thinking went with a prerequisite for anything resembling complex, deliberate, meaningful behavior. Careful treatment of the dead. Symbolic thinking. Anything beyond simple instinctive survival. Homo naledi's own discoverers went on to make a series of claims that, if fully accepted, would knock that entire assumption over completely. Berger's team argued that the pattern of bones scattered across multiple separate chambers deep inside this cave system, chambers reachable only through those same brutal, narrow passages, suggested naledi bodies had been deliberately carried down into the darkness and placed there over an extended period rather than all dying together in some single catastrophic accident. No predator damage marked the bones. No evidence turned up of bodies being swept in by flooding or fast-moving water, the kind of thing you'd expect if these individuals had simply washed into the chamber by accident. In a handful of specific spots, the team went further still, describing what they interpreted as deliberately dug pits containing single individuals, one curled into a position resembling later unmistakably intentional human burials, elsewhere in the world arranged in a way that seemed difficult to explain through gravity and chance alone. Later announcements pushed the claims even further, pointing toward markings on the cave walls the team described as deliberate geometric engravings, cross-hatched lines and simple geometric shapes, and evidence of small fires, charcoal and burned bone that might have lit those same impossibly dark passages for whoever made the difficult journey down. Naturally, not everyone in the scientific community found these claims fully convincing, and this is exactly the kind of moment worth pausing on tonight because it says something important about how this whole field actually operates. A separate group of researchers publishing their own detailed rebuttal, not long after the initial announcements pushed back. Hard, arguing the supposed burial pits could plausibly have formed through entirely natural processes, water movement, sediment settling the slow, ordinary geology of an active cave system. They argued the wall markings had never actually been dated, and could in principle have been carved far more recently by someone else entirely, perhaps even modern visitors exploring the same passages long after Naledi itself had vanished. And they argued the fire evidence needed far more rigorous documentation, clear stratigraphic context, reliable dating directly tied to the burning itself, before anyone could responsibly link it to Naledi specifically, rather than to some later visitor passing through the same cave thousands of years afterward. It's worth asking yourself, honestly sitting here tonight, which side of that disagreement feels more convincing to you. And it's worth noticing too that neither side is arguing out of stubbornness alone. Extraordinary claims, the kind capable of rewriting a species' entire reputation, understandably demand an equally extraordinary standard of proof before the rest of the field signs off on them. Maybe Homo naledi really was carrying its dead into the deepest, darkest reaches of an almost impossibly dangerous cave system on purpose over and over across generations, developing something startlingly near to ritual behavior with a brain barely a third the size of ours. Maybe natural processes, water, gravity, the simple bad luck of wandering too far into an unfamiliar passage, explain everything researchers have found without needing to invoke any deliberate behavior at all. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest place to leave things before we move on, tonight the truth sits somewhere frustratingly in between real enough evidence of something unusual happening in that cave without quite enough certainty yet to say precisely what. Whatever the final answer turns out to be, Homo naledi has already done something undeniable to this entire story. It's cracked open a comfortable assumption plenty of people, researchers included, had been leaning on for a very long time, the tidy idea that brain size alone reliably predicts how sophisticated, how thoughtful, how nearly human a creature's inner life actually was. A small brain, it turns out, may never have been quite the ceiling on complexity everyone assumed it was. It raises an uncomfortable, slightly wonderful question worth sitting with. If something this small-brained might have grieved, gathered and remembered its own dead, what exactly are we actually measuring all these chapters into this story when we try to draw a clean, confident line between something merely animal and something worth calling human? There's something worth sitting with in that thought as you drift towards sleep tonight. Somewhere in the deepest, darkest chamber of a cave, most people would never willingly enter, a creature with a brain smaller than yours may have been quietly doing something that looks from every angle researchers can currently measure remarkably like grief. Or it may not have been anything of the sort at all, simply an unlucky pattern of geology, dressed up by understandably excited researchers in language borrowed from our own species' most sacred rituals. Either possibility honestly deserves a moment of respect before we move on, tonight the first for what it might mean, the second for reminding us how easily wonder can tip over into wishful thinking, even among careful, well-trained scientists. But Naledi's story also raises an uncomfortable question that stretches far beyond one unusual cave in South Africa. If a small-brained species living less than 250,000 years ago could behave in ways this complicated, quietly overlapping with the earliest members of our own species without anyone fully realizing it, until decades of careful digging revealed the truth, what does that actually mean for where our own species came from, and whether the story of Homo sapiens really began in one single tidy location, the way it's so often told, one cradle, one cave, one confident dot on a map? As it turns out, the honest answer to that question would end up scattered across an entire continent, rather than tucked neatly inside any single cradle at all. The honest beginning of our own species turns out to be scattered across a continent so wide it would take you weeks to walk from one edge of the evidence to the other. Let's start in 1960 at a mining site in Morocco called Jebel Irhoud, tucked into a stretch of dry hills between the Atlantic coast and the edge of the Sahara. Workers digging for a mineral called barite, used at the time mostly for industrial purposes, blasted into an old cave system that had been sealed off from daylight for longer than anyone standing there could have imagined, and pulled a skull out of the rubble along with a scattering of other bones. Picture the scene for a moment. Dust still settling in the beam of a miner's lamp, ordinary industrial work suddenly interrupted by something nobody on site had any training to properly identify. Nobody working that mine had the faintest idea what they'd actually found. The skull eventually made its way to a doctor, then to a university professor, and for decades afterward, most researchers who examined it assumed it belonged to some sort of unusually old Neanderthal relative roughly 40,000 years old, an interesting but hardly earth-shattering addition to Morocco's fossil record. A paleoanthropologist named Jean-Jacques Hublin first encountered this same skull early in his career tucked away in a museum collection, and something about it never quite sat right with him. A nagging feeling that the standard explanation didn't fully match what he was looking at. Years later, in 2004, he finally convinced local authorities to let him reopen excavation at the original site, a process that ended up requiring an entirely rebuilt access road and the careful, patient removal of thousands of cubic meters of rock just to get back down to the layer where the original miners had made their accidental discovery decades earlier. It's the kind of stubborn, decade-spanning persistence that rarely makes it into a headline, even though it's usually the actual engine behind every dramatic discovery this series has covered so far. What his team eventually pulled from that reopened site changed the conversation completely. Remains belonging to at least 5 separate individuals, 3 adults, a teenager and a child scattered among stone tools, evidence of fire and the butchered bones of gazelle, zebra and wildebeest. Using 2 independent dating methods, one measuring trapped radiation inside heated flint tools, the tiny electrical charge locked into the mineral structure the moment it was scorched by an ancient campfire. Another measuring similar radiation damage locked inside the teeth, themselves accumulated slowly over millennia of quiet burial underground. Hublin's team arrived at a figure that stunned nearly everyone in the field. 2 entirely separate methods applied by 2 separate specialists landing on essentially the same number is about as near to a scientific handshake as this field ever gets. Somewhere between 300,000 and 315,000 years old. Sit with that number for a moment, because it's worth appreciating just how dramatically it rearranged the map. Before this discovery, the oldest confirmed remains of our own species had been sitting quietly in East Africa, dated to somewhere around 195,000 years. Jebel Irhoud pushed that timeline back by more than 100,000 years and moved the location clear across the continent from Ethiopia to the far northwestern corner of Africa. Here's the detail that makes this particular skull worth lingering over a little longer, honestly. The face looked remarkably familiar. Thin brow, ridges of face tucked neatly underneath the skull rather than projecting forward the way it does in more ancestral hominins proportions, near enough to yours that you'd probably recognize the resemblance immediately if you passed this person on a street today. But the brain case told a slightly different story, longer and lower than a modern skull, missing the rounded, almost balloon-shaped profile that characterizes brains like the one currently sitting inside your own head. Isn't that a strange thing to picture? Tonight of all nights, a face already recognizably yours wrapped around a brain that hadn't quite finished settling into its final shape. Researchers studying this pattern have suggested something worth sitting with. It looks the face, the part of us most people instinctively associate with looking human, may have finished evolving well before the brain's outward shape caught up to it. Perhaps as increasingly complex internal wiring gradually reorganized the brain case from the inside out over tens of thousands of years still to come. Now here's where this story gets properly interesting, because Jebel Irhoud wasn't a lone isolated exception. Rewind to 1967, more than 1,000 miles east along Ethiopia's Omo River, where a young researcher named Richard Leakey, part of the same family whose name is quietly threaded through nearly every chapter of tonight's story, led an expedition that recovered 2 partial skulls from a site called Kibish, near enough to the river that the team had to work around seasonal flooding just to keep the excavation open. One of them, known simply as Omo, the first, looked startlingly modern, a flat face, a proper chin, a high rounded forehead, the kind of skull you could plausibly place on a subway platform today without anyone giving it a second glance. The second skull, found not far away, and likely from roughly the same window of time, told an entirely different story, thicker, more heavily built, with a sloping forehead that looked considerably more ancient by comparison, closer in overall shape to something you might expect from 100,000 years earlier. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. What do you make of two individuals quite possibly alive at nearly the same moment in nearly the same place, looking this different from each other? Which one, if either, would you have confidently pointed to and called one of us? It's a little like meeting two members of the same extended family at a reunion and realizing they barely resemble each other at all, and yet somehow both of them undeniably belong at the same table. Originally dated to around 130,000 years, a reanalysis in 2005 using the same kind of layered volcanic ash dating that's come up more than once, already tonight pushed that figure back to roughly 195,000 years, holding the title of oldest confirmed Homo sapiens for over a decade, right up until Jebel Irhoud quietly took it away. Put these two sites side by side for a moment, one in the far north, one clear across the continent to the east, both producing fossils recognizably modern in appearance, both surrounded by evidence of stone tools and fire, separated not just by thousands of miles, but it turns out by tens of thousands of years as well. A third Ethiopian site, a place called Herto, adds yet another data point to this same emerging picture. Skulls dated to somewhere between 154,000 and 160,000 years old, discovered alongside faint deliberate scratches, suggesting some of these skulls have been carefully handled and possibly curated after death. A small, unsettling hint of ritual behavior sitting right alongside the bones themselves. Add in a fourth location further south still, a partial skull from a place called Florisbad in South Africa, tentatively dated to somewhere around 260,000 years, its exact classification still debated, but its rough age uncomfortably near Jebel Irhoud's, and the old comfortable idea of a single birthplace for our species starts looking increasingly difficult to defend. For a long time, the dominant story researchers told themselves ran something like this. Somewhere in East Africa, one relatively small isolated population of early Homo sapiens crossed some threshold, gradually accumulated the traits that make us, and then slowly expanded outward from that single point, carrying those traits with them, like a single seed, spreading roots across an entire continent. It's a tidy story. It fits neatly into a single sentence, the kind of sentence that looks good, stitched onto a museum wall, printed under a single confident illustration of one small sunlit valley, labelled more or less the birthplace of humanity. It also, according to a growing body of evidence stretching from Morocco to Ethiopia to South Africa, appears to be substantially wrong. Hublin himself discussing the implications of the Jebel Irhoud discovery in front of a room full of journalists pushed back directly against the idea that his own find simply relocated humanity's birthplace to a different single spot on the map. There is no Garden of Eden in Africa, he told them plainly. Or he added, if there is one, it's the entire continent. It's a memorable line the kind reporters love printing in a headline, and it also happens to be a remarkably accurate summary of everything the fossil record has been quietly suggesting for years. What the evidence increasingly points toward instead is something researchers now call a pan-African origin, a picture in which early Homo sapiens traits didn't spring up in one lucky location and radiate outward, but developed gradually, unevenly and simultaneously across a whole network of populations scattered from the Atlantic coast to the Indian Ocean, connected by migration routes across the Sahara that at the time looked nothing like the desert we picture today. Lakes, rivers and grasslands stretched across what is now some of the driest land on the planet. An almost unrecognizable green corridor connecting north to south, allowing populations to drift, meet separate and occasionally exchange both tools and genes across staggering distances. Try picturing that for a moment if you can. the exact same stretch of sand currently associated with camel caravans and shifting dunes once green enough to walk across without a drop of water in sight. Herds of grazing animals wandering past where a sand dune now sits. Not every researcher accepts every piece of this picture without pushback, and it's worth pausing on that honestly for a moment. Some specialists studying the Jebel Irhoud remains have raised the possibility that this particular population might represent something slightly different, a population still retaining older facial features from an earlier ancestor, rather than a fully confirmed early branch of Homo sapiens itself. One well-known critic pointed out that Hublin's team never directly compared their find against a roughly contemporary but geographically distant archaic skull from Spain, leaving open the possibility that Jebel Irhoud's face might simply be holding onto older features rather than actively evolving new ones. The disagreement hasn't been resolved and probably won't be until a handful of additional fossils from this same narrow window of time turn up somewhere else across the continent, patiently waiting their turn in some sediment layer nobody has excavated yet. There's a small detail worth connecting back to something we spent real time with only a little while ago in this story. Jebel Irhoud's dates, it turns out, overlap almost precisely with the surprisingly young age researchers eventually were assigned to Homo naledi, that small-brained, large-jointed cousin species tucked away inside a South African cave system we spent real time with earlier tonight. Which means, for a stretch of tens of thousands of years, our own species still not entirely settled into its final shape, may have been sharing this same restless continent with at least one other strikingly different kind of human relative entirely, each one in its own way quietly writing a separate chapter of the same enormous unfinished story. Maybe Jebel Irhoud really does represent the earliest confirmed edge of our own species, a face already recognizably ours pushing up through the last layers of something older. Maybe the honest answer is more diffuse than any single fossil could ever fully capture. A whole continent's worth of populations inching toward the same general destination from several different directions at once, occasionally meeting, occasionally drifting apart, never quite converging into one single point. Researchers could confidently circle on a map. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest place to leave things before we move on. Tonight, the very question of where we began was always slightly the wrong question to ask, built on an assumption, one lucky spot, one founding population that the fossil record itself has been patiently, quietly correcting for years now. There's something worth sitting with in that thought as you drift towards sleep. Wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, whichever continent, whichever corner of it the honest origin story behind your own face traces back not to one single place, but to an entire landscape of places all working on some version of the same problem at roughly the same time long before any of them had the faintest idea the others existed. No single valley gets to claim the credit alone. No single museum wall, no matter how confident its illustration, quite manages to capture the whole truth. Just a wide, connected, patient continent, quietly running the same experiment in several places at once, and eventually somehow arriving at something recognizably like all of us. Bones and skulls can only tell part of this story, though, no matter how many sites researchers eventually add to the map. Because there's another kind of evidence entirely one carried quietly inside every living person alive right now, folded into a molecule too small for any microscope from Hublin's generation to have properly examined, that would eventually confirm this scattered continent-wide picture in a way no fossil, no matter how well preserved, could ever manage on its own. That molecule turned out to hold something bones alone could never quite offer. Not a single dramatic skeleton, not one dramatic skull, sitting quietly in a single drawer waiting to be reconstructed. A pattern instead spread thin and quiet across every single living person on the planet, waiting patiently for someone with enough patience and enough mathematics to actually go looking for it. In 2005, a group of researchers led by a geneticist named Sohini Ramachandran working at Stanford set out to test something almost stubbornly simple. If humanity really did begin somewhere in Africa, then the genetic fingerprints of people living today should still carry a trace of that, beginning faint as it might be buried, as it might be under hundreds of thousands of years of migration, mixing and change. It's a little like trying to figure out where a rumour first started purely by noticing how much the story has changed by the time it reaches you several dozen retellings later. Here's the idea they were testing, and it's worth understanding properly because it comes up again and again once you start looking for it. Imagine a single small group of people leaving their home community to settle somewhere new. They can only carry a fraction of their original community's full genetic variety with them, simply because a small group of travellers will never contain every version of every gene present back home. Now imagine a smaller group splitting off from that new settlement to move somewhere further still, carrying an even smaller slice of an already reduced set of genetic variety. Repeat that same process for thousands of generations across tens of thousands of miles, and something remarkable happens. Genetic diversity doesn't just spread out evenly across the globe. It quietly, measurably shrinks the further you travel from wherever that very first group originally started out. Researchers call this a serial founder effect, and it leaves behind a signature nearly impossible to fake. Ramachandran's team gathered genetic data from populations scattered across every inhabited continent, measuring diversity at more than 700 different points along the human genome, and then tested dozens of possible starting locations, plotting genetic diversity against distance from each one candidate location after another, patiently checking the mathematics against Cairo, against Beijing, against Paris, against dozens of other reasonable-sounding starting points somebody might have proposed. Only one location produced a clean, steady, almost eerily consistent decline in diversity the further away you measured: East Africa. No site in Europe fit nearly as well, no site in Asia. No site anywhere else on the planet came near matching the pattern nearly as convincingly, no matter how the researchers adjusted their assumptions. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you lined up genetic samples from dozens of populations around the world today, purely on paper with no fossils, no dates, no maps attached, do you think you could work out where humanity actually began just from how much variety each population still carries? As it turns out, yes. Quite precisely, in fact. Have you ever spit into one of those small plastic tubes mailed off to a consumer genetics company, curious what percentage of this or that region your own ancestry supposedly traces back to? Nearly all of that entire industry, every colourful pie chart, every percentage breakdown rests on exactly this same underlying principle, comparing your own genetic variation against carefully studied reference populations, tracing threads of inherited diversity back toward wherever they thin out the least. It's a strange thought, honestly, that a birthday gift so many people now treat as a bit of harmless fun is quietly built on the exact same science, responsible for rewriting where our entire species came from. There's a strange, almost poetic detail buried inside this pattern that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. The exact same kind of decline diversity thinning out the further a population travelled from Africa shows up in an entirely unrelated place: human language. Researchers studying the number of distinct sounds called phonemes used across languages worldwide noticed the very same trend. Languages spoken closer to East Africa tend to use a noticeably larger set of distinct sounds, sometimes well over 100, while languages spoken at the far edges of humanity's ancient migration routes, deep into the Americas, for instance, tend to rely on a considerably smaller, more compact set of sounds, instead sometimes barely a third of that number. Nobody fully understands why language would echo genetics this closely, though the leading explanation borrows the exact same logic as the serial founder effect itself. Small groups splitting away from larger communities simply carry fewer sounds with them, generation after generation. The the same quiet erosion happening to spoken language that happens to genes. Isn't that a wonderfully strange thing to sit with tonight? Two completely different systems, one written in the language of proteins and inherited traits, the other spoken out loud around a fire every single evening for tens of thousands of years, both quietly recording the exact same ancient journey in their own separate vocabularies, without either one having the slightest idea the other was keeping the same record. For a long time, that genetic pattern alone was treated as fairly strong proof of a single tidy point of origin, one relatively small founding population somewhere in East Africa, spreading outward from there. Given everything we spent time with only a little while ago in this story, the scattered fossils stretching from Morocco to Ethiopia to South Africa, you might already be able to guess where this particular chapter is headed next. In 2023, a researcher named Brenna Henn, working alongside colleagues at several institutions, published a study in the journal Nature that took this same kind of genetic detective work considerably further. Rather than simply comparing modern populations against a single assumed point of origin, Henn's team built detailed mathematical models comparing genetic data from present-day African populations directly against the physical fossil evidence we've spent the last little while exploring. Together testing which population history could actually explain both sets of evidence at once, running scenario after scenario through careful statistical modelling until one particular shape of the family tree consistently outperformed all the others. The old model, one small founding population branching outward in a single clean line, struggled to account for everything researchers were seeing. What fit the data considerably better instead was something researchers now describe as a weakly structured stem, a mouthful of a name for a remarkably elegant idea. Rather than one isolated population quietly becoming human in splendid isolation, Henn's model points towards several closely related populations scattered across different regions of Africa, evolving somewhat separately for long stretches of time, while still remaining just connected enough to occasionally exchange genes across the distance, drifting apart, drifting back together again and again for hundreds of thousands of years. It fits remarkably well alongside everything we already spent time with a little earlier tonight, that scattered handful of ancient skulls stretching from Morocco to Ethiopia to South Africa, each one recognisably human, each one slightly different from the others, exactly the kind of pattern you'd expect from several loosely connected populations, working toward the same general destination, rather than one lone population getting there first and handing the finished blueprint to everyone else. Think about what that actually means for a moment compared to the tidy family tree most of us probably grew up picturing. Not one trunk with humanity branching cleanly outward from a single root. Something closer to several trunks standing fairly near one another, their roots quietly tangled underground the entire time, occasionally grafting back onto each other in ways no simple diagram could ever properly capture. Would you have guessed before tonight that the honest scientific picture of your own species beginning looks less like a single family tree and more like a small scattered grove? It's worth pausing here to appreciate exactly how remarkable it is that any of this can be reconstructed at all honestly. Nobody who existed through any part of this story left behind a single written word. No maps, no family records, just fragments of bone scattered across a handful of excavation sites, and it turns out an extraordinarily patient kind of evidence carried quietly inside every cell of every person alive today, readable now with technology that didn't exist even a single generation ago. There's still real uncertainty tucked inside this picture, and it's worth being honest about that before we go any further tonight. Henn and her colleagues have been careful to point out that gaps in both the fossil record and the available genetic data still leave plenty of room for revision. Ancient deoxyribonucleic acid, the kind extracted directly from bones, rather than inferred from living populations, remains almost entirely unavailable from Africa's deep past, since heat and humidity tend to break it down, long before researchers ever get the chance to study it, unlike the colder regions of Europe and Asia, where ancient genetic material survives considerably longer, sometimes for hundreds of thousands of years, buried safely in permafrost or cold cave sediment. It's a frustrating irony, honestly, that the very continent holding the deepest, most important chapters of this entire story also happens to have the climate least forgiving toward the one kind of evidence that might settle these remaining questions once and for all. Which means for now this entire genetic picture is being reconstructed largely from the DNA of people living today, working backward through mathematics, rather than pulling it directly off a million-year-old bone. There's a quiet, unifying thread worth pulling out of all this data before we finish this particular chapter, one that has nothing to do with charts or percentages at all, no matter how different two people might look, standing next to each other, whatever continent, whatever background, whatever language. Either one grew up speaking, the genetic evidence keeps pointing toward the same underlying reality. Every one of us carries some version of that same ancient scattered African inheritance, just distributed a little differently, shaped by a slightly different set of journeys, migrations and reunions across an almost unimaginable stretch of time. The differences that seem so obvious on the surface turn out to be a remarkably thin layer sitting on top of something far older and far more shared than most of us ever stop to consider. One detail from that living evidence deserves a moment of its own attention before we move on tonight. Among the population studied most closely by researchers piecing together this deep genetic history, the Khoisan peoples of southern Africa consistently show some of the deepest, most distinct genetic lineages found anywhere on the planet, branches of the human family tree that split away from the rest of us earlier than almost any other population studied. A recent survey of ancient genomes recovered from this same region, spanning burials more than 10,000 years old, down to remains barely more than a century old, found something remarkable. A thread of genetic continuity running through this specific corner of southern Africa for something nearing 9,000 years, one of the longest, most stable population histories documented anywhere in the human genetic record. An unbroken thread running quietly underneath everything else happening across the rest of the continent, and the rest of the world during that same enormous stretch of time. It's a quiet, powerful reminder that the deepest roots of this entire story aren't only buried in ancient bone. Some of them are still walking around today, carried forward by living communities whose ancestry reaches back further than almost anyone else alive. Maybe the full precise shape of this weakly structured stem will hold up exactly as currently modelled once more. Ancient African deoxyribonucleic acid finally becomes available to test it against directly. Maybe some details will shift considerably once researchers find a way around Africa's harsh climate, destroying genetic material before anyone can study it. Some new laboratory technique nobody has invented, yet quietly waiting its turn, the same way CT scanning was waiting, unimagined, when Jebel Irhoud's skull first sat misclassified in a museum drawer decades ago. Or maybe, and this feels like the most honest place to leave things, before we move on tonight, the full truth will always resist being captured by any single clean model, because the actual history spread across an entire continent, working across hundreds of thousands of years, was never really built for tidy summaries in the first place. There's something worth sitting with in that thought as you drift towards sleep tonight. Somewhere inside your own body right now, quietly copied into essentially every cell you have, sits a faint mathematical echo of a story too old and too scattered for any single family tree to properly hold. Not one ancestor, not one valley, a whole tangled grove of them drifting apart and reconnecting across an entire continent, patiently working out over hundreds of thousands of years how to become whatever it is you are right now. Lying here listening to a voice describe a story written in your own cells. Every breath you're taking as you listen carries somewhere in the machinery behind it a signature written by that same long scattered patient process. We've spent a long time tonight following scattered footprints, buried tools, reconstructed faces, and quiet genetic echoes, each one a small separate piece of an enormous unfinished puzzle. It feels like the right moment now to step back from all of it just for a little while and ask what any of this actually means for the person lying here tonight on whichever side of the planet you happen to call home. Let's go back just for a moment to the very beginning of tonight's story, because it's worth remembering exactly where we started before we let this particular journey settle. A crack in the ground, that's all it was at first. A slow patient splitting apart of solid rock somewhere in eastern Africa 30 million years before anyone existed to notice it happening. No ancestor watching from a hillside. No brain large enough to wonder why the earth beneath their feet kept refusing to hold still. Just stones splitting quietly apart mountain by mountain, valley by valley, rearranging an entire landscape into something no other stretch of this planet quite managed to become. Mountains rising where flat forest once stood, lakes filling low ground that had never held water before. A whole continent patiently redecorating itself with absolutely nobody around yet to appreciate the renovation. We asked right at the start of tonight why this particular continent, out of every possible stretch of land on Earth, ended up writing the opening chapters of every single human story that followed. It felt back then like the kind of question that might deserve one clean, satisfying answer, a single cause you could hold in your hand and set down neatly beside all the others. And by now, hopefully you're holding a fuller answer than any single sentence could ever properly deliver, one considerably messier and considerably more honest than anything that would have fit neatly into that opening question alone. It wasn't one reason. It was never going to be one reason. And honestly, by now you probably suspected that from the very first chapter tonight. It was a crack in the ground that refused to stop moving feeding lakes that filled and vanished on a timeline too fast for comfort and too slow for any single generation to fully notice. It was legs that learned to stand upright long before any brain understood why standing mattered, wandering out from Chad to Kenya to Ethiopia, each population quietly running its own version of the same stubborn experiment, none of them aware the others existed. It was a stone picked up by hands nobody expected to be capable of picking up much of anything, and struck against another stone hard enough to open a door nothing on this planet had ever walked through before. It was a lake that vanished within a single lifetime, and another one after that, and another, forcing whatever survived to keep adjusting, keep guessing, keep refusing to settle into any single comfortable way of living. It was a hungry, growing brain paid for one difficult meal at a time, eventually warmed and fed by a fire that some careful hands finally learned to keep alive after dark gathered around by ancestors, doing in their own quiet way exactly what you're doing right now. It was an entire crowded family tree, cousins and rivals sharing the same muddy shoreline within hours of each other, most branches eventually falling silent one branch hours, somehow managing to keep bending instead of breaking. It was a face pieced back together from fragments that sat forgotten in a drawer for years, still arguing with scientists about exactly which chapter of the story it actually belongs to. It was a small, quiet cousin species tucked away in the deepest, darkest room of an almost impossible cave, doing something that still looks from every angle researchers can measure remarkably like grief. And it was never just one cradle either. It was Morocco and Ethiopia and South Africa and dozens of other unnamed corners of this same enormous continent, all working on some version of the same problem separately and together, drifting apart and quietly reconnecting for hundreds of thousands of patient years, until somehow without any single moment you could circle on a calendar, all of that scattered stubborn effort became you. Here's one final way to hold all of that time in your mind before we let it go completely tonight, because 30 million years is not a number any of us are built to properly picture. Imagine compressing this entire journey into a single calendar year, January to December, with tonight landing on the very last stroke of midnight, December 31st. On that scale, the crack in the earth wouldn't even finish opening till sometime in early spring months of quiet stretching and splitting before anything resembling an ancestor existed to notice. The first ancestors, confidently standing upright wandering between Chad and Kenya, wouldn't show up until early October, with most of the calendar year already behind them. Lucy wouldn't take her first careful upright steps across that Ethiopian riverbed until the third week of November, right around the same days so many families sit down together for a holiday meal. Turkana Boy, and the earliest confident evidence of a controlled fire, wouldn't arrive until the second week of December, practically the tail end of the year. Homo naledi tucked away in that impossible cave, and the earliest confirmed face of our own species in Morocco wouldn't appear until the day after Christmas, a mere handful of days before the ball drops. And everything else, every single thing you might associate with the word history. Writing, cities, pyramids, empires rising and quietly falling, every name you learned in school. All of it, the entire recorded span of human civilization, would fit inside the final couple of hours before midnight on New Year's Eve, a small, bright, frantic sliver of activity tacked onto the very tail end of an almost unimaginably long, quiet year. You are standing right now, in the last few seconds before that midnight strikes. There's one more thread worth pulling together before we let this particular story rest for the night, and it has nothing to do with rocks or bones or ancient lakes at all. It has to do with the people who spent their own years patiently piecing this whole story back together one fragment at a time. A family of fossil hunters whose name kept surfacing again and again tonight 3 generations deep. A woman who followed a wrong turn into the desert and found tools older than anyone thought possible. A man who spent 2 decades rebuilding a road just to reopen one stubborn cave in Morocco. A team of scientists slender enough and brave enough to squeeze through gaps most of us would never willingly enter. None of them share a single drop of blood with each other, and yet in their own quiet way they behaved a little like the very story they were digging up, scattered across different countries, different decades, different specialties, occasionally crossing paths, occasionally building on a stranger's earlier work without ever meeting them, and somehow together assembling something none of them could have finished alone. And the truth is, they're nowhere near finished yet. Somewhere in a desert nobody has properly surveyed, or a museum drawer nobody has reopened in decades, or a cave system somebody hasn't found the right narrow crack into just yet, the next chapter of this same story is already sitting there patiently waiting for its own version of a wrong turn, or a stubborn decade-long excavation, or a piece of technology that hasn't been invented quite yet. Everything we walk through together tonight was once exactly that kind of waiting fragment too, unread, unnoticed, sitting quietly in the dark until somebody finally arrived to listen. Here's the part I actually want you to sit with tonight more than any single fact we've covered. You are still carrying every single piece of that story with you right now in this exact moment. The legs that finally settled underneath you, tired and heavy, no matter how long your day happened to be first, learned their balance millions of years ago on ground that kept threatening to shift underneath the very first ancestor who dared to stand fully upright on it. Every ordinary step you took today to the kitchen, to the car, down a hallway toward this exact bed, quietly repeated a motion first pressed into wet volcanic ash long before anyone could have written it down. The restless, ever-adjusting habit of mind that got you through today, whatever today happened to demand of you, is the same restless habit that once helped some distant nameless relative decide whether to stay beside a shrinking lake or take a chance on wherever the horizon happened to point instead. The hand resting somewhere near you right now, maybe tucked under a pillow, maybe curled loosely at your side, still remembers somewhere deep in its structure the exact same grip that once turned an ordinary stone into the first tool anyone on this planet had ever deliberately shaped. your brain quietly humming away even now as you drift towards sleep, still burning through its outsized share of your body's entire energy budget without asking your permission. First is the same hungry, expensive organ. Generations of ancestors slowly, painfully learned to afford one difficult meal, one warm fire, one shared evening beside the flames at a time. Somewhere behind your own shut eyes right now, that same expensive, demanding organ is still quietly working, sorting through the day, settling into the kind of rest it has been earning one calorie at a time for nearly 2 million years. And somewhere inside, nearly every cell in your body quietly copied and passed down without a single written word ever needed to explain it, sits a faint mathematical echo of a story that never had just one starting point. Not one valley, not one lucky ancestor standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. A whole scattered, tangled grove of them spread across an entire continent, occasionally losing touch with each other for tens of thousands of years, and somehow patiently finding their way back generation after generation until that same quiet reunion eventually produced you. Isn't it strange? And maybe a little wonderful to realize that none of this required you to do anything at all. You didn't earn this inheritance. Nobody does. It was simply handed down, generation folding quietly into generation, an unbroken chain reaching back far enough that the word ancient barely does it justice anymore, arriving finally tonight in you, lying here listening to a voice describe a story that was really about you the entire time, even during the parts that seemed to be about cracked earth or vanishing lakes or face pieced back together from broken fragments in a museum drawer. So wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, whatever corner of the world you currently call home, whatever language filled your childhood, whatever your own face happens to look like in the mirror each morning, know this. Underneath all of it, quietly, patiently sits the exact same beginning. A crack in the ground, a creature learning to stand, a stone that learned to cut, a fire that learned to hold back the dark, a whole restless continent working out together, scattered and separate and somehow still connected, how to become every single person who's ever existed, including tonight you. Somewhere near the very start of this journey, I asked where you happened to be listening from and what time it was where you are right now. It's worth sitting with that question one more time differently before we wrap things up. Because no matter how far apart we might actually be tonight, no matter how many time zones sit between your pillow and wherever this story first reached you, the honest, patient answer to where either of us really comes from turns out to be exactly the same. Not a country, not a coastline. A single, restless, endlessly inventive continent quietly doing all the hard work, centuries before either of us ever got the chance to say thank you for it. Thank you honestly for spending this time with me tonight, following this particular story all the way from a crack in the earth 30 million years ago to the quiet, ordinary miracle of you falling asleep right now. Stories like this one only really work with someone patient enough to listen the whole way through, past the volcanoes and the vanished lakes, past the crowded family trees and the arguing scientists all the way to the end, and that patient someone happens to be you. I don't take that lightly, and I mean that. If tonight's journey gave you something to think about, or simply gave you a calm, steady place to rest your mind for a little while, I couldn't ask for more than that. There are more stories like this one waiting other corners of the deep, distant past, still worth wandering through. Together other cracks in other pieces of ground, other quiet discoveries still sitting patiently in drawers, somewhere waiting for the right pair of hands and the right story to finally bring them back to light. I would love nothing more than to have you back for the next one whenever you're ready for it, whatever corner of the world and whatever hour of the night happens to find you then. For now though, let the day go. Let your thoughts slow down one by one the way a fire settles into embers, long after the flames themselves have quieted the same fire in a way that some careful, patient ancestor first learned to keep alive after dark so very long ago. You've carried an entire continent's worth of history inside you every single day of your life without ever needing to think about it, and tonight you can simply let it rest, the same way it has patiently for longer than any of us can properly imagine. Shut your eyes if they aren't already. Let your breathing settle. Let the room go quiet around you. Sleep well, rest easy, and I'll see you again quietly at the start of the next story.